Enemy and Rivals, Fae Wilds Series, Book 5, written by WJMAY, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 13.
I will gather the others to support Solomon's claim over his brothers, Mace told her quickly. We will return quickly in the hopes that he may still be here, ready to do what must be done.
Gilly nodded, watching him scurry to the door and shoo away the women who had gathered just outside. He then shut the door behind him, leaving Gilly alone with the grieving Dev. She took a step forward and put a hand on his shoulder. Squeezing gently, she struggled to find a way to support him in this moment. Moving around to beside him, she went to her knees and took one of his large hands into hers. "What happened to your mother?" she asked softly, her eyes searching. Gilly wasn't certain he would answer her, but after a moment he looked up and let out a ragged breath. "I might have been born in Deep Sands, son of the estate's master, but my place was never here. Not really." He indicated the portrait, his raw emotion on open display for the first time she'd known him. That kind, gentle, and beautiful woman was father's second wife. His first had died when Saeed was still a boy, and my mother hadn't come along until years later, when my brother was nearly a man grown. His eyes closed as he recited his sad history. Saeed was left to his own devices for too long with no moderating influence. As the master's son, he helped himself to whatever he wanted. My father, a victim of his grief for too long to introduce any discipline. Saeed was left with a shriveled heart because he was never taught how to use it. This statement was profound, and she could see that it had taken years and distance for Solomon to come to grips with his brother's motivations. But his young loss didn't justify his adult behaviors. Saeed knew he would be forced to share when I was born. Mother said that father was joyous to recapture his youth with her, to start over again, but for my brother, there was no room for anyone else in his father's affections. "Your brother resented you and your mother," Gilly said, stating the obvious. He nodded at her, his hand squeezing hers gently, making some of the tension between them subside. "When my father was still hale and healthy, my brother didn't dare do anything to overt, but when he fell ill with the wasting sickness, Mother knew it was only a matter of time, and Saeed wasted no time consolidating power while my mother and I tended to father." Gilly could imagine it, the same round-cheeked boy, his dark eyes now filled with sorrow as he stood beside the woman in the portrait at his dying father's bedside. Her sympathy for the Dev grew, and she began to understand the man he'd become. "The dirty cob didn't wait for father's passing to make his move. No, he wasted no time demeaning me in my people's eyes. The name he calls me, Shirk, I won't tell you its meaning, but he demanded use of that epithet for me, and before long, any respect I had as the second son was gone. Even second son became a curse on the estate." "That explains the guard's treatment of him." Gilly frowned, her desire to defeat Saeed growing as the words spilled out of the Dev. "My mother was immune for a while, but as soon as it was clear my father would not recover, my brother began to work on my mother. She stuck close to the women's quarters, where she had the most support. But she never gave up on nursing my father, which necessitated being in enemy territory as Saeed began calling the shots." His face tightened, and she could tell that he was struggling with what he was about to say. "I woke up early one morning in her bed, where I slept by her side so I could keep an eye on her, and she on me. But she wasn't in bed. When I came out to search for her, I learned that she died the night before while I'd slumbered warm and carefree." Gilly shifted over to embrace him, wrapping her arms around him. It must have given him enough courage to go on. "It was an accident, so they said. They found her at the bottom of the stairs outside my father's room, her neck broken from a fall. It was dark there, and she neglected to bring a candle. One misplaced step, and she was gone." His breath hitched, and she could see unshed tears shining in his eyes. "I went to the baths where they were preparing her body, and I snuck into the room to say my final goodbye." Solomon's gaze burned into her. "The look in her eyes," he shuddered, and Gilly held him tighter. "The fear there. It has haunted me. Whatever happened to her, it wasn't an accident." She pressed his head into her shoulder, rocking gently. Grief poured out of him. "After she was gone, Saeed wasted no time punishing me. I believed he was waiting for my father's dying breath to pass, that as soon as it did, I'd breathe my last as well." "You ran away," Gilly filled in softly. "You had no choice." "I ran, you're right. But I was a boy of 12, and Haramanabad was a hostile place. I spent many days and nights alone and hungry in the hostile elements. I learned to be strong.
to take what I wanted from those weaker from me, and I vowed to come back here and have my vengeance."
"This is your time," Gilly said, her words picking up speed. "Your chance for vengeance, to make sure your mother didn't die in vain, to free those who suffered now like you suffered then." Solomon lifted his head and shook it slowly.
"I thought I could do it. He even used you as a bargaining chip to get one of the princes of darkness on my side to take back my birthright, but the moment I returned to Deep Sands, I knew that it was futile. The land is steeped in agony, bathed in shadow and blood. Nothing I should have come back to."
"You're wrong," Gilly insisted, putting his head between her hands. "This is exactly where you need to be, where you can right the wrongs of the past and create a better future." Her tone was earnest, and she could see Solomon's head lift in response. "Revenge might have been a reason to survive, but surviving isn't enough. I learned that myself recently." She released him, feeling suddenly vulnerable, but she couldn't expect him to crack himself open for her without returning the favor. "My parents were cursed by a sorcerer who intended to harvest our realm, not without creating chaos for centuries beforehand. My parents became mortal enemies, and my sister and I were caught up in their machinations. I was consumed with revenge against the Fae King, wanting only to take him and his kind down, never knowing that he was my mother's mate. And the worst part was, my mother completely transformed herself into a hard-hearted hag in order to turn her daughters into a weapon against him." She felt his hand on her cheek, and her gaze met his again. Gilly covered his hand with hers and managed a small smile. "I channeled all my energy into vengeance, and along the way, I sacrificed much. After the plot unraveled, I realized how much I missed. Torn between revenge and betrayal, I wasn't certain who I was when the curse was broken. The world I understood had ended, and I wasn't sure what the new world would hold for me."
"Sounds like we do have some things in common," he said softly, using his thumb to brush away a tear from her cheek. "I am thankful you were strong enough to make it through."
"So am I. And I'm even stronger now since I've decided to blaze my own path into the future." She laughed, the noise sounding strange to her ears. "Sure, I've been a little waylaid visiting exotic destinations, but the fact remains, I am not my past, and I make my future."
Solomon shifted and came to his feet, holding his hands out to her. Gilly took them, and the dev gently lifted her until she was standing in front of him. "I have never met anyone like you, Mujisa. You truly are a miracle, and your tenacity is the stuff of legends. But I'm afraid our similarities are outweighed by the differences as vast as the Dune Sea. I have no interest in my birthright and the pain it represents, the pain of generations." He looked past her, out one of the windows. "I was not going to ask the prince to help me root out my brother to take over the land myself. I was going to ask him to blight this place off the face of the earth so I would no longer have to know it existed, no longer have to remember it." His voice softened and trailed off at the end, and Gilly turned to follow his gaze out the window and past a dusty courtyard to the distance where long grasses waved gently in the breeze. She recalled his story about the tall grasses of the swamp where the swamp cat and her little had dwelled. "What happened to the kittens?" she asked softly, knowing that this was a heart-rending memory, but Gilly knew you had to go into the pain in order to come out the other side. She could understand the desire to block it all out, to obliterate it so it could no longer hurt him. But what would happen to the people who lived here? To the ones who inhabited Deep Sands and their ancestors before them? The best course of action was still to convince Solomon that his people deserved better than what they'd been given. And better than immolation. "Solomon," she prompted, finally distracting him from the view. "The kittens. What happened?" His monotone answer, devoid of effect, couldn't disguise how hurt the dev was. Saeed found out about the little family in the swamp and had his men string up the swamp cat. He knew it would upset my mother. He was fond of psychological warfare. And she was upset, but she refused to let my brother know that. The ghost of a smile passed his face. My mother was a formidable woman. "Sounds like it," Gilly agreed. The smile disappeared like it had never existed. "She brought the litter to the great house, right to my brother, who had taken to sitting father's seat. She interrupted an audience to carry the kittens into the audience chamber, in a little basket where they mewed for milk and attention. I followed behind, hiding behind her skirt." His gaze was far away again, in the past, as he continued his tale. Mother set the basket down and told Saeed that it was a sign, that the kittens were a symbol. 2 sons, just like myself and my brother. She then plucked a kitten from the basket and carried it to him, suggesting that he raise one, and I the other one. At first, he held the kitten gently, making little noises of comfort to the creature. My mother thought she'd managed to break through his hard exterior. Gilly's heart beat harder, expecting the climax of the tale to be something she wouldn't want to hear. We'd just reached the door to the hall when we heard a crack. I turned back to see the kitten's head lolling and realized he'd snapped its neck. She gasped, feeling sick, her hatred for Saeed growing exponentially. Mother smuggled the other kitten to the women's quarters, where it was doted over and cared for, even after her death. He let out a breath. I couldn't take it with me when I fled, but I've held out hope for a good life here among the women. I'm sorry that you had to experience a trauma like that, she told him, sneaking her hand into his. And I can see why you'd want to block this place from your memory forever. But memory is a tricky thing. Even when it's gone, you still know something is missing. Instead of blighting the place, why not rescue its people from tyranny and give the estate to them? You don't want it, but they likely do, especially if the other choice is annihilation. He looked at her, his gaze boring deep. Gilly pressed the point. It may help you restore the piece of yourself that is missing, and it will honor your mother's legacy. Solomon glanced out the window again, not responding. The door opened slowly, the wizard's face peering around it. When Gilly gave him a nod, he pushed into the room, followed by a contingent of servants, a handful of guards, and 2 beautiful female demons in chains. Mace came to a stop a couple of paces from Solomon and bowed. We are ready, sire. Chapter 14. Solomon looked out over the small crowd assembled before them. He did not move, nor did he speak. He stood and stared, his expression unreadable. Gilly mentally ticked off the moments, the tension in the room increasing with each silent second. It was as if the room was filling with water. Gilly saw herself floating at the top, craning her head against the ceiling to get one last gasp of air before going under. Mace, she said, her tone sounding wild and panicked. She took a breath, then said his name again in a more moderate tone. Have you organized a plan for what happens next? The wizard looked from face to face in the crowd, then turned back to Gilly, a sheepish expression on his face. We hope to take the guards by surprise and overwhelm Saeed while he's incapacitated. Once Solomon has bested him, he can banish him from the estate for good. Solomon let out a harsh bark of laughter. Sounds like a perfect plan, except you haven't told me how you plan to deal with the djinn, or how you plan to keep my brother from just coming back here with a bigger contingent of men and wiping us out. Gilly forced a smile on her face, silently growling at Solomon for his defeatist attitude. That djinn is a head-scratcher, she admitted, patting Mace on the shoulder. But you seem like a very clever wizard. There must be a method that has crossed your superior mind. Mace cocked a bushy white eyebrow at her, then gave a shrug. We'd have to turn him to our side. The djinn doesn't serve Saeed willingly. He was compelled by an oath he swore, but the oath was a result of trickery. No one is sure how Saeed managed it, but I expect he'd be willing to lend a hand to whoever could free him from his compulsion. See, Gilly said, her pitch rising as she motioned to Solomon. We've just got to convince him to join our side. She turned back to the wizard. And how is it going? Bringing him over to mutiny? Mace looked down at the floor. No one has yet had the courage to approach the djinn. He is powerful, and if it goes wrong, he'll alert Saeed to our plot. Disappointment pricked her, but she pushed it away, pretending to be unfazed. Well, it sounds like I have a mission then. I'll convince the djinn to join the resistance myself. In fact, I'm just the Fae for the job. Not a chance in hells, Solomon said, attempting to shut down her plan before it was fully formed. Come on, Solomon, she said in a friendly tone, punctuating it by lightly punching his arm. I've got the skill set required, thanks to my abilities. I just need to find... Her eyes scanned the room, looking for an appropriate opening. They landed on the demon females, and her mind started to turn. It's too dangerous, Solomon insisted. Yesterday you didn't even know what a djinn is, and now you think you're the one to sell him on betrayal? Freedom, she corrected, holding up her index finger. I'll sell him on freedom, his and ours. Gilly approached the demonesses, who were hovering toward the back. Their skin had a reddish tint, their bodies more voluptuous than the other females. Many of the residents of Deep Sands looked like Solomon, and she assumed they were some species of dev, but others, like the females in chains, were demons, their horns, teeth, and shades of skin giving them away.
"What's with the restraints on those two?" she asked Mace. "The other females don't seem to be wearing chains." "They're members of Saeed's harem," Mace explained. "Bought as slaves, the chains ensure that they do not teleport away. Only he can remove them, or his death. They're his reminder of ownership, I suppose." She had to push past her disgust at his revelation, her sympathy for the women making her feel a little off balance. But she was delighted to hear that some among them could teleport if their chains were removed. "I'll pose as one of them," she said with a nod. "How better to charm a djinn than as a demon seductress?" "I see you're having a laugh at my expense," Solomon said, his face full of frustration. "What you're suggesting is much too dangerous. If anyone should approach the djinn, it should be me." "And the moment you reveal yourself, the djinn will alert your brother. Or he could just decide to take you out himself in the hopes of impressing Saeed and earning his freedom that way." Gilly crossed her arms, a tone saying her mind was made up. "You have to admit that you're the worst choice to approach the djinn." "I'm forced to agree," Mace said, biting his lip. "You're too valuable to risk. Without you, all of this falls apart." "She's just as valuable as I am," Solomon growled. "I'm expendable," Gilly replied quietly, patting Solomon on the arm. "Let me do this. I'm the only one who can." She turned away from Solomon and approached the demon females. They were standing together, a little apart from the rest of the crowd. "Hello," Gilly said in a friendly fashion, flashing them a smile. "I'm Gilly of the Fae. Whom do I have the pleasure of meeting?" "Tasha," said the taller one, pointing to herself, then at her companion. "And Prem." Beautiful names for beautiful women. They were beautiful, their black horns shining in the light, their skin supple, their features fine. Both had thick dark hair, the taller one more slender and athletic, while the shorter was plumper with breasts that rivaled any Gilly had ever seen. "Which one of you do you think the djinn likes better?" Tasha and Prim looked at each other, then Tasha turned back to Gilly. "Prim. Many a night he has ogled her when Saeed is not looking." "Perfect," Gilly said, stepping between the pair and putting her arms around their shoulders. "Ladies, you're going to help me get your look. We're going to convince the djinn that his infatuation is about to become real." "No, no, no." Solomon grabbed Gilly's arm and pulled her away from the demons. "This isn't going to work." "Why not? It sounds like we have a shot. If the djinn is infatuated with Prim, then maybe he'd be willing to switch sides and make off with one of the boss man's harem." It was logical to Gilly's ears, but not to the devs. "Just stop," he insisted, leaning in to speak into her ear. "We already know how skilled you are at seduction. This won't work." Gilly pulled away, glaring up at him. "Just because you didn't respond to my tactics doesn't mean the djinn won't." She returned to the demons. "Okay," she said, peering closely. "Let me get a good look at you." She did her best to memorize Prim's features, then closed her eyes and drew on her powers. She could feel her body changing, could feel the disguise taking hold. Gilly opened her eyes and held out her arms. Shifting this way and that while looking herself over, she gave a nod. "What do you think? Will it fool the djinn?" Tosh and Prim stood with identical open mouths. They slowly nodded, Prim peering in with a look of awe mixed with revulsion. "It's unreal. You could be my twin." "Sorry, I've already got a twin," she said with a wink, then turned around only to pause when she saw the look of anger on Solomon's face. "You've got to ignore him. Your plan is a sound one, and this wouldn't be the first time he's doubted you, only to come up wrong." She didn't want to think about the times she doubted the dev and been in error herself. Only by convincing herself that this could be done, that the djinn could be won over and Saeed deposed, could she have a chance of actually pulling this off. "Please," he said simply, "don't do this." Gilly stood on her tiptoes, circling her arms around his neck. "Don't worry," she said, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. "Have some faith in your favorite Fae." He looked a bit disturbed at the kiss, and Gilly had to remind herself she was now wearing someone else's face. Releasing him, she took a step back and gave him a salute. Then she turned and headed toward the door. Solomon grabbed her hand before she could exit. "Gilly," he said, and she almost dropped her spell out of shock at the use of her name. "I know you think you're doing the right thing, that you're helping, but we should be on our way, fleeing across the sands now, and not pitting ourselves against a being that is a step away from undefeatable." "Let me go," she said gently, channeling a little energy to the silver ring to make him obey. "You stay here and come up with a plan of attack for when I've got the Jinn on our side." He released her hand and watched her go, out the door and into the bright sunshine, headed in the direction of the great house and their destiny. Chapter 15. The beating heart of Deep Sands, the great house as Solomon had called it, was emptier than before. Gilly picked her way down the hallway, attempting to avoid the refuse and the dogs as she searched out her target. She passed a room where 2 guards were playing cards. One looked up and saw her, then glanced back at his cards, dismissing her. Letting out a sigh of relief, she continued forward, walking the way she expected a voluptuous demon might. There was no one to appreciate her hip rolls and pushed-back shoulders. Gilly assumed the majority of the servants were with Mace and Solomon back at the women's quarters, which means it shouldn't be hard to find the Jinn. Then she remembered that the creature could turn himself invisible. He could be anywhere, lurking around any corner, ready to spring out and attack. Gilly calmed herself, knowing that it was pointless to worry about an invisible enemy. Her disguise would provide a viable defense, and if she was persuasive enough, they'd soon have a way to win possession of the estate. She turned a corner and picked up the sound of snoring coming from somewhere down the hall. Gilly followed the sound, peering through an archway into a small room dominated by a throne-like cushioned chair. She saw Saeed, master of the estate, sprawled in the plush chair. Above him swung 2 woven fans, seemingly operating of their own accord. His mouth was open, his snores echoing around the small chamber. He wasn't alone. On a cushion at the foot of the chair sat the Jinn, legs crossed, expression bored. Gilly extended a finger and crooked it at the Jinn, gesturing for him to come to her. When he got sight of her, annoyance covered his face. Increasing the intensity of her gestures, she finally convinced the Jinn to join her in the hall. "What do you want? You know if those fans stop for 1 second, he'll wake up in a rage." The Jinn was impatient, tapping his foot. A little bell on the tip of his curved shoe jingled fitfully as a result. "Is that any way to talk to a lady?" she replied, hoping to sound provocative. The Jinn, however, took her tone as peevishness. He snorted. "Some lady. Whatever game you're playing, I'm not interested." When the Jinn started to head back into the room, Gilly stepped in front of him, brushing her fingertips across his cheek. "You don't have to run off. He's asleep. We have some time to get to know each other." Inside, Gilly was wincing. Maybe Solomon is right. Seduction is not my skill set. The Jinn's eyes went wide. His gaze found its way to her oversized bosom and stayed there for a moment before he suddenly scowled. "Whatever your charming activity you have planned, you can purge it from your mind. I have no desire to take a demon lover, and I'm not going to remove the chains, no matter how much you beg, plead, or offer." "Saeed is beneath you," she said, changing tactics. "We both know it. I can tell you aren't happy serving such an inferior lord." The Jinn cocked an eyebrow at her, then shrugged, saying nothing. He turned back to the doorway again, and Gilly knew she was on the verge of losing him. "I've heard you were tricked into your oath. Wonder how your fellow Jinn feel about that." This statement regained his attention. His demeanor was cold. "What would you know about it, demoness?" It was Gilly's turn to shrug. "I know it hurts to be considered a laughingstock by your own kind." "You will mind your tongue, viper, lest you lose it." The Jinn's face was full of fury. "Or if your master won't part with your tongue, there are plenty of other ways to punish you." Gilly held up a hand to cut off the flow of his words. "What would you give to the person who frees you from your oath?" "It's impossible," he replied with a shake of his head that tossed his top knot from side to side. "Only Saeed can free me, and he's never going to give up his powerful pet." He looked the demoness up and down, a scowl on his face. "Besides, what you're saying is starting to sound alarmingly like treason." Gilly hesitated, wondering which tactic to try next, but in the moment she stood without speaking, the djinn re-entered the room and called out to his sleeping master. "Saeed, you've got a viper in your midst." The slumbering dev let out a snort and blinked bleary eyes in the djinn's direction. "What did you say, Raven?" He rubbed his face. "A viper? Are you talking about my brother, because he's got no fangs to speak of?" Gilly started to move away, heading toward the nearest exit. But she didn't make it very far. An invisible force pulled at her, like a half-dozen hands dragging her backwards. She attempted to access her own power to arrest her momentum, but nothing she did stopped her body from moving into the room. When she reached the plush chair where Saeed was sitting, the invisible hands shoved her to her knees, landing her next to the dev's feet. The djinn stood beside him, his expression neutral. An expression of surprise appeared on Saeed's face. "Prem, what is she doing here?" The djinn happily answered his question, reporting almost word for word what Gilly had told him in the hallway. Saeed chuckled at the laughing-stock comment, but his mirth was short-lived. "You tried to convince my djinn to turn on me? When I've been so kind and generous." Gilly looked down at the chain linking her wrists. "I doubt whatever you've been is nowhere in the realm of kind or generous." "He lies," she said simply with a shrug of her shoulder, hoping to extricate herself from the situation without alerting them to the plan of rebellion. "He ogles me without end, and just now propositioned me. I told him I belonged to you alone, and he vowed to see me punished." A dark eyebrow arched over Saeed's beady eye. "Is this true, Raven?" he asked the djinn without breaking eye contact with Gilly. "Not in the slightest," the djinn replied, then waved his hands. Gilly could hear her own voice coming from behind her, tiny and small. She turned around to see what resembled a shallow vertical cloud, and on its surface replayed the events of just before the dev's waking. She watched as the figure she impersonated made overtures to the djinn, and her spirit sank. Whatever my plan was, I need to come up with a new one. By the time the replay finished, Saeed had built himself up into a towering rage. His eyes burned with anger, his face mottled red. "You dare to go behind my back, trying to turn the djinn against me for your own ends?" Gilly knew her impersonated persona was getting her nowhere. When Saeed raised his hand, clearly intending to land a blow on the demoness, she acted on instinct. Dropping her disguise, she revealed herself to Saeed, causing him to freeze in place. "You!" Inclining her head, she became the picture of obeisance. "My apologies for deceiving you, Lord," Gilly said in her most contrite tone. "I felt as if I had no choice." "What are you doing here?" he hissed. "And how did you escape my dungeon?" Gilly allowed a small smile to form on her face. "We Fae have our ways. Ones we prefer to keep secret. It was a necessity, I'm afraid." Her eyes met his, and she schooled her expression into one of bald admiration. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since we met." He pressed his lips together, shaking his head. "And I'm supposed to believe you? I just saw you flirting with my djinn, and now you want me?" "Your djinn is of no account," she responded. "I was only attempting to distract him so that I could have your full attention." Taking a calculated risk, Gilly bowed farther, placing her forehead against the cold stone floor. "You're the one I need." "I see what you meant by viper now," Saeed said to the djinn. "And what about my brother? You fought ferociously at his side just yesterday, not to mention your callous rejection of my offer to let you warm my bed." Gilly didn't expect this to be easy. She knew it wouldn't be easy to convince the dev of her shifting loyalties. "I have to appeal to his vanity, but more than that, to his hatred of his younger brother and the insecurity that makes him so selfish and hateful. I apologize for what I said before. The truth is, my position in your realm is a precarious one. I've offended your prince, and it is for the reason that I cajoled your brother into bringing me here. He said it would afford me a modicum of safety, but from the way he spoke, he talked as if I already owned this land. I wasn't aware that you were its rightful master." The dev chewed over her words. "Leave it to my brother to brag about things he doesn't own. A more useless creature was never shat into civilization. Still, that doesn't tell me why I should bother with you." "It is true that there is little I can offer you beyond companionship, although you've seen that I do have my own magical gifts that may come in handy to you someday." The djinn let out a laugh, interrupting her, but Saeed's attention was still focused on her.
He could have already wished me back to the dungeon or worse, she told herself. He's sniffing around the bait. All I have to do is set the hook. But there is a proposition you may be interested in. If you grant me shelter and allow me to remain on your estate, then I will take care of your brother's punishment myself. Best of all, you can watch. Saeed's face bit in a wide smile, and he let out an indulgent chuckle. I wasn't prepared for such ruthlessness in such a slight-looking female. You've intrigued me. What exactly have you got in mind? Gilly let out a breath, relieved that she'd finally managed to hit upon something that might work in her favor. Now I've just got to figure out how to degrade Solomon to his brother's liking. Putting her disgust at the idea out of her mind, Gilly prepared to spin the dev a yarn.
Chapter 16. I came to your realm by way of a mendacious demon at the behest of a foul sorceress who had kidnapped me from the Fae Realm in the hopes of stealing my powers. Lee endeavored to hit the big beats of her journey to convince Saeed that Solomon meant nothing to her compared to her own needs and desires. She knew the only way to convince the dev to succumb to her charms was to appeal to his vanity while also making herself appear a tempting ally. And deriding his younger brother doesn't hurt either. Sorcerers! Saeed spit like a curse. They're always hungry for more magic. That is why I have a policy of beheading any who dares to enter my estate on sight. A wise policy, Gilly replied with a nod. The demon double-crossed the sorceress, much to her chagrin, taking me for himself. He was intent on selling me at a slaver's market, but your brother came along with his ragtag gang and stole me away, along with the other most profitable prizes on the auction block. My brother the raider, the dev said, with a thoughtful scratch of his chin. I'd pictured him a beggar in some forgotten alley among the filth of the gutter. It is easy to see him as such, sire, she replied, hurrying on with her story. At the time, however, I thought that he could protect me until I could find my way back home. Now, I realize he isn't strong enough, hard enough, powerful enough. He's not like you, sire. He isn't even fit to walk behind your shadow. Saeed smiled, and she could see some of the tension going out of him. The dev seemed to enjoy the tale she was spinning. That must have become obvious to you the moment you disturbed my meal. My brother is no match for me. Agreed, she said, creeping forward to put her hand on his muscular thigh. I know you'll be able to keep me safe. Only the most powerful things have Jinn to serve them. Jinn made a strangled noise. And what's to convince our sire that you aren't some vicious conniver waiting to betray him like you're betraying his brother now? If we could have a moment alone, I would be happy to convince you, Gilly replied in her sultriest voice. Her hands slid higher until they were dangerously close to a region she wanted to avoid with every fiber of her being. The dev's eyes were filled with a new light of appraisal. She had his interest, Gilly was certain. All I need to do is get him alone. Then I might be able to incapacitate him enough to do some real damage. She was caught off guard when the dev reached down to grab her wandering hand. With a quick yank, he pulled Gilly into his lap. His wet lips found her shoulder, and he kissed her there, then nipped with sharp teeth. She forced herself to remain still and allow this violation of her person, in the hopes that it would gain her the privacy she needed to advance her plan. When his mouth moved from her shoulder to her neck, Gilly let out a forced giggle, then wrapped her arms around Saeed's neck. Pretending to enjoy his attentions, she leaned in to whisper in his ear. I would love to get to know you better, but I'm shy, my lord. I want to show you my appreciation, but not with an audience. On the contrary, the dev said, removing his lips from her body to Gilly's relief. An audience is exactly what we need. If you're so keen to be rid of my brother, then you can prove it. Saeed turned to the Jinn, an evil grin on his face. Bring my brother to me, now. The Jinn looked bored. With a sigh, he snapped his fingers. A moment later, Solomon stood before them, looking confused. When he saw Gilly on his brother's lap, the confusion was replaced with pure rage. What are you doing? Surprised to find your female sitting in a superior male's lap? Saeed asked with a chuckle. To punctuate his point, he ran his tongue down Gilly's neck. It was one of the most difficult things Gilly had done, but she managed to convey pleasure and not disgust at the sensation. I have to pretend I like being here, no matter what it does to Solomon. That's the only way I'll be able to convince Saeed that I'm telling the truth. I've got to wait until he's vulnerable to strike, and right now, with the Jinn standing at his right hand,
I'm far more vulnerable than he." "Oh, my lord, you're so naughty." Her giggle was flirtatious, and she rested her head on Saeed's shoulder, ignoring his fuming brother. "You haven't seen naughty yet," Saeed replied in a husky tone. He gripped her chin to pull her head into position, then pressed his lips against hers. The kiss was hot, wet, and above all, revolting. Gilly had to hold back the rising gorge and go along. She sighed against his lips, then repressed a gag when she felt his tongue into her mouth. The sound of Solomon cursing broke her heart, but she had no choice but to submit to his brother until they could figure out a way to turn the tables. "Release her or face my wrath!" Saeed broke the kiss, turning his gaze to his brother. "Your wrath?" He laughed, shaking his head. "How is it that after all these years you haven't learned the first lesson I tried to teach you? What's mine is mine, and what's yours is also mine." "You're the one about to learn a lesson. Why don't you face me like the lord you claim to be, instead of relying on your pet djinn to fight your battles?" Solomon's face was like stone, his hands balled up into fists that were ready to strike. "Spoken like a man without a djinn," Saeed laughed, giving Gilly a gentle shove. He indicated a wooden box decorated with leather that sat on a small table nearby. "Fetch that box, sweetheart. I think your jilted lover would like to see what's inside." Anxiety filled her, but Gilly did as she was told, knowing that whatever was in the box, she wouldn't like it. Returning with the box, she held it out to the dev. Saeed removed the lid, tossing it aside, and placed his hands into the box to lift out its contents. At first glance, Gilly thought the creature in his hands was alive. Then she noticed its shiny, lifeless eyes. Her heart collapsed in on itself, and pain filled her, a pain she knew would be 100 times greater for Solomon. "It's one of the kittens," she realized. The little swamp cat that Solomon's mother had said was a symbol of the 2 sons of Deep Sands. Saeed must have had it stuffed after he snapped its neck, she realized. It was a sick bid to torture his brother, one that he'd waited years to be able to enact. The sight had its intended effect. Solomon was rigid, his eyes filled with a look of dread that grew darker when Saeed's hands delved into the box once again, pulling out an identical kitten. Gilly realized with horror that it was the kitten Solomon had been forced to leave behind. His brother had taken it from the woman and destroyed it out of spite, she was certain. She remembered the way he'd spoken in the woman's quarters, the way she'd held him as he worked his way through one of the most painful memories of his life. And here was his brother taunting him with the very memories Solomon had tried so hard to banish. He gave up his claim to this estate and planned to have it destroyed, all to avoid this moment. Gilly wanted to go to him, to put her arms around him and tell him she'd do everything in her power to make things right. Then I destroy this waste of a carcass. Although she wanted to comfort him with her entire being, instead she chuckled along with Saeed, taking a kitten from him and rubbing its fur against her face. Gilly didn't dare look at Solomon's expression, knowing it would shatter her. Saeed leaned forward, retrieving the kitten from her hands and setting them aside before encircling her waist with his arm. He nuzzled her neck, and Gilly knew he was salting his brother's wounds. "I have never hated anyone, even King Lear, whom I used to revile, more than I hate this greedy and venal creature. I vow to every deity in the web that I will find a way to make this acorn hoarder pay, no matter what it costs me." "Why are you doing this?" Solomon said after a moment, his voice hoarse. Gilly glanced at him, and in that moment she could see the wounded boy inside of the nearly broken man in front of her. She could imagine the pain and confusion he must have felt when someone who was supposed to be as close to him as anyone could be, an older brother to protect and mentor him, was instead a cruel despot bent on torture and destruction. The betrayal still stung Solomon to this day, his hurt on full display. Saeed straightened, turning his head to drink in his brother's suffering. "You're just like your mother, aren't you? Not a drop of father in you. In fact, I warned the old man on several occasions, told him you couldn't be his whelp. You were a cringing, craven little thing, the runt of the litter, not the pack leader like his real son." "Are you saying I'm illegitimate? Not our father's son?" Solomon's voice was low and uneven. His brother nodded. "What else could my father expect from the whore he married?" Solomon recoiled as if slapped. Gilly could see that he held his mother up as a paragon of virtue, a protector who had done everything she could to keep him safe, but was overwhelmed by the evil forces that surrounded her. Saeed loved to see the effect his words were having on his brother. The dev lived to inflict pain, and he smiled as he continued to push Solomon's buttons. She thought she could swoop in and scoop up his riches with her feminine wiles, but I put a stop to that, didn't I? Just like I'll never let you take what belongs to me. At his brother's sneer, Solomon went rigid before his muscles started to tremble with rage. You killed her! I thought it then, but I know it now. Since father was still alive, you tried to make it look like an accident, so your precious inheritance wasn't at risk. But I know you killed her, and then you planned to kill me. But I escaped you then. I shouldn't have run. I should have stayed and slit your throat while you slept. With a final snarl lashed with pure hatred, Solomon transformed, letting the monster inside him overtake him. I am not running now, he said, then launched himself at his brother, intent on ripping Saeed apart. Chapter 17. For all his vicious anger, Solomon's charge on his brother ended abruptly when he found himself frozen by a lazy snap of the jinn's fingers. You want me to rid you of this annoyance, O great and powerful sire? The jinn asked in a bored tone. Saeed ignored him, instead focusing his attention on Gilly. How about you, Jamila? He asked, then ran a finger from the lobe of her ear to the pointed tip, making her shudder. The dev took her reaction as one of passion and smiled at her. It's time for you to prove your worth to me. Show my brother the punishment you claim to be capable of providing. Gilly had hoped this moment wouldn't come. She tried to convince him of her loyalty by offering to punish Solomon for him, but she'd hoped to get him alone before being forced to follow through on her proposition. Saeed was the one who deserved to be lashed with her powers, not his brother. But if she were going to pull off any kind of manipulation, she'd have to prove she could be trusted, which means I have to hurt the man I love. It would be my pleasure, she replied with a sharp grin. A decision made, Gilly stepped away from Saeed and turned to face his brother. The room dimmed as dark clouds covered over the ceiling, thunder rolling along to announce their presence. Filling herself with magical energy, lightning crackled the Fae's fingertips. It's now or never, she thought, letting the energy build. It's time to show everyone what I'm made of. While thunder crashed loudly above her, she raised her hands and looked at the man who had been her companion in this harsh hell realm. He looked at her, his expression blank, but in his dark eyes she could see that hopelessness was consuming him. The pain there was mixed with something that resembled heartbreak. Gilly took a fortifying breath, then released the lightning, pouring all of her strength into the blast. Solomon closed his eyes, accepting his fate, but they cracked open a moment later and filled with shock. The lightning exploded as it hit her target, a target that wasn't the one Saeed intended. The jinn let out a howl of pain as the lightning encircled him and squeezed inward, electrifying his body. Caught without warning and with no preparation, the being had no time to react and therefore took the full brunt of Gilly's attack. She shocked him for as long as she dared, and when she released the lightning, the jinn collapsed in a smoking heap. Solomon, she said, turning back to give him a smile. Punish your brother. The order was accentuated with a thread of energy into the silver ring around the dev's finger, compelling him to obey. Fortunately, the order jibed with Solomon's own desires, and freed from the jinn's control, he leapt forward, ready to destroy the man who'd taken so much from him. By the time Solomon reached his chair, Saeed had flung himself over the back of it. He shoved the heavy seat at his brother, using the delay to unleash his own inner monster. His form shifted, muscles swelling until he was over 9 feet tall and double his former size. Fat tusks rose from his bottom lip, and when he let out a roar, thick strings of spittle flew from his open mouth. The brothers came together with a tremendous crash, limbs flying, blows landing. But Gilly didn't have the luxury of watching the battle take place. She had to keep an eye on the jinn, who was already pulling himself to his feet. He fixed her with a hateful look, then lobbed a ball of crackling green energy at her head. Throwing herself at the floor to avoid being hit, Gilly scrambled out the open door, hoping to lure the jinn into following her. She's used the door as cover to release a burst of wind. It encircled behind the jinn to push him forward in her direction. The jinn answered with a wind of his own that pushed against the door hard enough to swing it backwards, taking Gilly with it. Her back slammed into the wall, then the door slammed into her, knocking the breath out of her body. She knew she didn't have time to recover, however, so she slipped out from behind the door to stand in the middle of the hallway. The djinn stepped out of the room where the sounds of a fearsome fight between the brothers was creating quite a racket. "This was your little plan all along, wasn't it?" he asked, the look on his face informing Gilly that he was finally taking her seriously. "I'm afraid that it's a very foolish plan. Your abilities are no match for mine." "What do you know about the powers of the daughter of the Fae Queen?" she spat back. "Pride cometh before a fall, you know." Gilly punctuated her point by dropping low to press her palms against the floor. A sudden rumble sounded in the corridor, and the ground beneath the djinn's feet shook, hard enough to make him falter. He closed his eyes and clapped his hands together, and the ground stopped shaking. "Your paltry parlor tricks are little more than an annoyance," he growled. "I am the raven of the married jinn, the most powerful of my kind, chosen to battle with the very angels of the heavens." "Raven, eh?" she replied, unimpressed. "What are you going to do? Peck me to death?" Gilly hoped his anger would lead to a mistake, anything that might allow her to get the upper hand or at least survive the encounter. Her gambit worked, the djinn's hot temper overriding his better judgment. Instead of shifting to his non-corporeal form, he remained flesh, which meant he could be hurt. But it didn't mean he was done trying to subdue the Fae. Through a series of elegant movements, he channeled a whip of fire and swung it at Gilly. It wrapped around her torso, setting her robes alight and scorching the skin underneath. She fell to the floor and rolled down the corridor to unravel herself from the whip and extinguish the flames, ignoring the pain from the burns. The djinn bore down on her, cracking the whip above him before bringing it down again, but Gilly managed to narrowly avoid his swing by scrambling closer to him. Kicking at his knees, she managed to bring him down, and when the djinn lost his grip on the whip, it vanished. Gilly spied a few paltry wisps of green that had broken through a small crack in the clay tile floor thanks to the state of disrepair Saeed had allowed the house to fall into. Wasting no time, she used her natural ability to encourage the weed's growth. The blades sprang up, evolving rapidly until there were dozens of them, each reaching her upper thighs. She twisted her fingers and the grass blades twisted around the djinn, attempting to capture him in a cage of green. Faster and faster the blades grew, more and more joining the effort to completely incapacitate her enemy. Gilly was panting, every muscle on high alert, wondering if perhaps the djinn's powers had been overstated. Then each of the blades of grass began to decay rapidly and fall away, leaving the djinn standing in the corridor, dusting the remnants from his robes. "Cute," he said with a mock amusement. "What's next? You're going to strangle me with the little girl's ribbons?" "How about my bare hands?" she growled, going for a physical attack. Gilly ran at the wall and then up it, flipping over the djinn's head and grabbing his topknot along the way. She used it to slam him to the ground again, then pounced on his chest. Raising a hand, she used her magic to make her fingernails grow into sharp claws. "Let's see how this little birdie likes kitty's claws." She swung her hand down to rake his face, leaving 4 bleeding furrows. The djinn's eyes were filled with shock, and Gilly got the impression that he hadn't been involved in a physical fight for ages. "He relies on his powers to keep people away, but I plan on getting real up close and personal." Before she could, however, the djinn vanished. Her knees hit the floor, her quarry nowhere to be seen. Gilly scrambled to her feet, scanning the area for any sign of the creature. Her sign came in the form of a large crack appearing in the ceiling above her. A large chunk detached itself and fell toward her, and she had to dodge it to avoid the blow. Several other cracks appeared, pieces of the ceiling flying. It was like a gauntlet of dust and debris that Gilly was forced to navigate, twisting and turning as bits of wall and ceiling flung themselves at her. She soon found herself at the end of the hall facing 2 branching corridors. The leafing djinn could be anywhere. She froze, recalling that the djinn wasn't the only one who could avoid being seen when he wanted. Ducking around a corner, she concentrated on extinguishing all light in the area, sucking it into herself. She stepped back into the shadows, knowing she'd be fading from sight for anyone looking for her. Gilly crept forward, sticking to the shadows as she picked her way around the fallen chunks in the nearly dismantled corridor. Her eyes were searching for the djinn, but he was nowhere to be seen. She'd almost reached the doorway where Saeed and Solomon were continuing to duke it out when a monstrous dev form was tossed through the doorway to slam into the opposite wall. It was Solomon, and he was bleeding heavily, but his wounds were not enough to make him give up the fight. He rose and threw himself back through the door, tackling his brother and taking him down. Gilly watched the battle, unable to look away until she heard the sound of many footsteps heading in her direction. Spinning around in the shadows, she saw a contingent of guards heading in her direction at a run. Gilly knew they were rushing to their master's aid, which meant Solomon was about to be greatly outnumbered. I can't let that happen. Gathering her powers, she layered a thin sheet of ice on the hallway floor between herself and the oncoming guards. When they hit it, the first row faltered, some falling, causing the ones behind to run into them. The second row slipped upon reaching the ice, pulling down the ones behind them. Soon enough, it was chaos. Then, just as suddenly, the chaos was gone as the ice melted. The guards reassembled themselves, and Gilly cursed the djinn who must have been responsible for the contradiction of her spell. She readied her magic, ready to attempt to block them in another way, but she was worried that her powers were running low. The fight with the djinn, coupled with her taking on the form of the demoness, meant she was dangerously low on energy. Gilly lifted her hands, ready to expend everything she had to protect Solomon, but a loud blast of what sounded like trumpets sounded from behind her. She whirled around, watching the end of the hallway, and excitement filled her when she saw Mace turn the corner, staff held high. Behind him were dozens of household staff, a few guards, and females from the women's quarters. All had been armed, and from their expressions, Gilly knew they were intent on winning the day, because if they didn't, it would mean the end of their lives. The tip of Mace's staff took on a glow, and a hot wind blew from that direction, headed toward the estate guards. Just in front of the guards, the wind transformed into a buzzing horde of stinging insects that attacked the men. It was the distraction needed for Mace to get his people into position and bow down on the guards, their weapons raised high. Only her Fae hearing allowed Gilly to hear the shout of agony from the room over the clatter of the armed groups coming together. Risking revealing herself, she stepped from the shadows and rushed through the doorway. Her eyes widened when she found Solomon crouching over his brother, his hands round Saeed's neck. Gilly approached cautiously, not wanting to startle the dev and risk distracting him. Her voice coached as low as possible to still be heard over the fray outside. She called his name. "Solomon, I'm here." She didn't know what to say other than she was there to support him, but she wasn't sure he heard her words. His expression was intent, his entire focus on his fingers that were squeezing tightly, cutting off his brother's breathing. Saeed's face was red, his eyes bulging and his tongue lolling out of his mouth. He's killing him, Gilly knew. The life starting to fade from the older dev, and I don't know how to feel about it. Saeed's crimes were heinous, and the Overlord was more than deserving of death in her opinion. But given Solomon's history and his unstable emotions regarding his family, she wasn't sure he was the best person to mete out justice. He was the second son, the protector and avenger his people had been waiting for, which was an argument for Solomon as executioner, but the truth was, Gilly was afraid he'd regret it. That part of the light in his eye would die with his brother's last breath. Holding her breath, she watched as Solomon slowly strangled his brother, the world around them seeming to stop as Gilly watched Saeed's demise. Chapter 18. Solomon let out a feral groan and suddenly released his brother's neck, leaving Saeed to wheeze and sputter. The elder brother held his neck, a look of blind betrayal in his eyes. He pushed himself away from Solomon to the opposite wall, clawing himself into a sitting position and releasing his monstrous form. He looked small and of no account compared to his massive monstrous brother. She watched as the Solomon straightened, his enormous form panting, a conflicted look in his eye. Gilly placed a gentle hand on his arm, not knowing what to say. Outside, the battle continued, and they were still pursued by the invisible djinn, so this was not the time to delve into personal emotion, but she couldn't help herself. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, but Solomon didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the door and walked through it, lending his massive hands to the ongoing skirmish. Gilly remained to catch her breath and to watch over the other dev, who appeared too weak to continue the fight. Saeed looked at her with loathing in his eyes. "You Fae are worse than sorceresses," he spat, his voice harsh and hoarse. She could see the red marks left by Solomon's hands around his neck. They weren't showing any signs of fading soon. "Don't be a sore loser," she warned him, "lest your brother rethink his decision to spare you." "I'll spare none of you," he barked. "When my djinn—" "Hush!" Gilly said, cutting him off and casting a spell that temporarily sealed his lips. "I'm trying to watch the battle." Outside the room, she saw Solomon fling a guard past the doorway, then several others followed on foot, running away from the dev. She heard a cheer go up and her chest filled with warmth, but Gilly was still on the lookout for the djinn. This isn't over. That thing could materialize at any time and turn the tables on us. We need to finish this." Members of the resistance poured into the room, their foes having been put to flight. They were fewer in number than before, making Gilly's heart ache for the casualties of their fight for freedom. Solomon was at the center, and he released his monstrous form, returning to the handsome male body that gave Gilly's stomach butterflies. Solomon was covered in bruises and blood, some still seeping from his wounds, but there was no sign of pain in his countenance. The eyes of his people were on him to lead them now that their evil master had been overthrown. He stopped before his brother, his face a blank. Then he surprised Gilly by extending a hand to help lift his brother to his feet. "Time for you to find out just how comfortable and luxurious your dungeon is, brother," he said quietly, then motioned for the rebel guards to take his brother into custody. The guards approached, surrounding the dev and walking him out into the hallway. Solomon followed, and his fellow rebels spilled into the corridor around them. Gilly opened her mouth to ask Solomon what his long-term plans were for his brother, but she was distracted by the sound of several gasps from the people gathered around them. Her eyes flew to Saeed, widening to see the demon female Prem, the one she'd impersonated, on his back, her chains tight around his neck. "Looks like someone disagreed with Solomon's mercy." Tasha appeared in front of Saeed, one of the guard's blades in her hand. She smiled at her former captor, then shoved the blade deep into his midsection. The dev let out a shocked sigh, then crumbled, hitting the floor as blood poured from his open wound. The demonesses embraced, and a sudden cheer went up from the crowd. Gilly turned back to Solomon, afraid that he'd lose his temper or worse. Instead, he stared back at her, heat in his eyes. Solomon grabbed her and pulled her into a tight embrace before pressing his lips to hers. The scorching kiss had her reeling, and she could barely hear the roar of the crowd, delighted at Solomon's display of affection. When he released her, she wavered. Feeling lightheaded, the dev put his arm around her, keeping her at his side. Shaking her head to clear it, she scanned the hallway for their invisible adversary. He's free from his oath now, she figured, now that his captor lay dead on the floor. But just because Saeed is dead doesn't mean that Raven isn't still dangerous. She craned her neck to see past the crowd and caught sight of a figure materializing at the end of the hallway. The djinn spotted her and sent a wink in her direction, then disappeared. Relief filled her, immediately followed by regret. There was another chance to get off-world that had vanished without a trace. Leaf-hating jerk, she thought, before remembering that the djinn wasn't the only member of the crowd that could teleport. She pulled away from Solomon, heading in the direction of the demon females, who were being lauded by their compatriots for their ruthless takedown of Saeed. Gilly hurried in her direction, a smile on her face. She assumed that since she'd helped them escape Saeed's clutches, perhaps they'd return the favor by teleporting her back to the Fae Realm.
"Gilly of the Fae," Mace said warmly, stepping into her path and folding her into an embrace. "I have never been more grateful to meet an off-worlder in my long life. You have given Solomon the courage and strength he needed to defeat the tyrant of not only his lifetime, but ours. You have my undying appreciation." "Thank you," she replied distractedly, trying to keep a bead on the demon females. "But Solomon could have done it all on his own. I just provided a little push." The wizard chuckled indulgently. "On the contrary, I think you've inspired our second son. He may not see himself as a leader or a lord, but he's always had the noble bearing of one in my estimation. In fact—" "Will you excuse me for a second?" Gilly interrupted, having lost sight of her targets. "I've just got to talk to someone very quickly." She patted the open-mouthed wizard on the shoulder, then hurried past him. When she arrived at the still warm corpse lying in a pool of his own blood, she paused, looking everywhere. The demonesses were nowhere to be seen. A few feet beyond the body, Gilly found the chains the horned females had been wearing. "Unleafing believable!" "What is it?" Solomon asked, approaching her, but very noticeably not looking at his brother's body. "The demon females are gone," she said, holding up the empty chains. "The djinn, too, and with them possibly my last chance of escaping this hell realm." Solomon looked at her, his expression strained. Then he glanced down at his brother's corpse and let out a sigh. Gilly considered asking him how he felt, having spared his brother only to watch the demonesses finish Saeed off, but before she could, Mace raised his staff, bathing the hallway in a red glow that brought conversation to a halt. "Friends, on this momentous occasion, it is only proper that we give thanks for our emancipation." He moved to stand beside Solomon, putting a hand on his shoulder. "For those of us who have suffered long under our previous master, our time of redemption is at hand. Solomon,
second son of Deep Sands, is now master of the estate."
Another cheer rang out, and pride filled Gilly's chest. But at the look on Solomon's face, she realized that pride wasn't the emotion he was experiencing in that moment. Mace continued, happier than she'd seen him. His tone vibrated with enthusiasm.
"We must have a feast of Thanksgiving to celebrate this historic occasion and—"
"Well said," Gilly interrupted, clapping excitedly.
"A feast is definitely in order. First, we should deal with the bodies of the slain. Then we can turn our attentions to a proper celebration."
Mace looked at her with confusion, then nodded. The people around him snapped into action at the wizard's direction, allowing Gilly to tug Solomon away from the carnage and outside where she could find out how the Deb was feeling about recent events. Once out under the twin suns of Ahriman, Solomon took a ragged breath, turning his face up to the sky. Gilly's heart went out to him, and she struggled to determine how best to address what had just happened. "So how do you feel about the brother who tortured you? The one who was responsible for your mother's death, having been killed in front of you after you spared his life?" It wasn't an easy question to ask. "How do you feel?" was what she settled on, moving to stand close to him and rest her head on his broad shoulder. He didn't respond at first, concentrating on his breathing until it was stable. When he finally did speak, it wasn't to answer her question. "You took unnecessary risks." Gilly tried not to tense, batting away his question like he'd ignored hers. "What will you do now? Stay here and be the lord your people want you to be?" Solomon shook his head and let out a long breath. "This isn't my life. Deep Sands was my home for a while, but Saeed has killed everything that mattered to me about this place. I cannot be happy here, living with my memories and haunted by his ghost." Raising her head from his shoulder, Gilly gave a brisk nod. "It's decided then. We continue on our quest, but tonight, let's give the people what they want." Gilly sat at the same table where they'd first met Saeed, Solomon seated beside her. It was evening, one sun chasing the other toward the horizon. Torches burned on the walls, and those remaining after the skirmish of earlier were gathered around the other tables, talking animatedly. There was a current of expectation in the air, as if everyone gathered was waiting for their new master's blessing. Rising to his feet at the head table, Solomon lifted his glass to those assembled. "Your bravery has been rewarded. You've freed yourselves from your oppressor and earned a future free from tyranny and degradation." Applause echoed around the dimming hall, smiles decorating most of the faces of those gathered. They looked up to Solomon, their chosen leader, not just because of his birthright, but because of his character. Gilly wasn't certain he was making the right decision walking away from his estate and the people on it. People who would cherish him, likely better than I could. After his toast, Solomon sat, and the feast commenced. Gilly picked at her plate, her appetite almost non-existent. Solomon had made some sort of peace with his past, but now his future was uncertain. Thinking back on their fiery kiss, she wondered if her own future was intertwined with his. It was a rare and beautiful thought, but one that was more wish than truth, she thought. He might not care about his birthright, but Solomon did have a life here among the raiders. His own estate in the Dune Sea, the one he'd earned with his ingenuity, was much finer than the one they currently occupied, and as he'd reminded her, Ahriman Abad was his home. But it wasn't hers, and Gilly refused to abandon her plan to return to the Fae Realm. Responsibilities waited for her there, as well as a family she was just now coming to know. As much as she might care for the Dev, she knew she couldn't transplant her life to his realm. We each have our own duties to ourselves and others on separate worlds. For us to come together, one of us would sacrifice who we are to live in the world of the other. Could I really ask that sacrifice of him, after all he's already given? Gilly didn't think so. Could I make the sacrifice myself, give up my position and my family, and try to eke out an existence in a realm where I'll always be waiting for the prince to find me and add me to his collection? The answer was the same. Pushing her plate away, Gilly forced a smile to her face, not wanting the rest of the assembly to know the dark thoughts circling her mind. Soon enough, they would set off on a journey that she hoped would end up with her back in the Fae Realm. What would become of Solomon, she was not certain. The only thing she did know for sure was that when she left him behind, she'd be leaving her heart with him. Chapter 19. Gilly ran her finger along the mantle of the ancient fireplace. It came away free of dust or grime, so she turned to give the servant a nod at her job well done.
The bedroom had been empty for years, by the smell of things, and she'd set the staff to work on cleaning it and another that sat nearby. "Are you sure about this?" she asked when Solomon walked through the door. "We may have succeeded in driving those still aligned with your brother off the estate, but aren't we worried that the prince may catch wind of what happened here? Deep Sands is so far into the inner desert that word of the coup won't make its way into any of the larger cities for days. Unless the demonesses talk, wherever they've gotten off to." Gilly was still disappointed at her loss of the demon females. "If only they'd stuck around, I could have gotten a free ride home without any of the uncertainty that comes with trusting a stranger in this hell of a realm." Solomon let out a breath and nodded. It could happen, but at this point we need to rest. I'm exhausted and doubt I could even change forms or travel by sand if I wanted to. And you look a little worse for wear yourself." Gilly gasped, putting on an aggrieved front. "Me? I'll have you know I've never looked better." He allowed half a grin onto his face. "My apologies. You are perfection incarnate, as always." Gilly gave an exaggerated bow, eliciting a small chuckle from Solomon before he continued. "At least now we're surrounded by friendly people, ones we can trust to watch our backs while we get a little sleep." "All right," she relented, then indicated the room around them. "This place has been cleaned top to bottom, so you can spend a restful night without wondering what creepy crawlies might be meandering their way into your bed." "Creepy crawlies are considered a delicacy here," he said with a wink. It was Gilly's turn to chuckle. She pulled back the blanket on the newly cleaned mattress and patted it. "Get some rest. I'll be in the room next door." She walked toward him, and for a moment she thought he might grab her and pull her into another steamy embrace. Instead, he gave her a quick kiss on the top of her head. "Good night, Mujisa," he said softly, then shut the door behind her once she'd walked through it. Gilly stood there for a moment, debating going back inside and kissing the dev silly. It's his fault for being so leafing sexy. Besides, a little celebration after a victory never hurt anyone. In the end, she went into her own freshly scrubbed room and shut the door. Gilly had a plan in mind, and making out with the dev would delay it. Solomon really does need the rest, she told herself. He hadn't slept for much of their jaunt across the realm. He'll just try to talk me out of it anyway. Better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Gilly made herself ready for bed, shutting the drapes and pulling back her blanket. The bed was small but comfortable enough, and soon she was counting backwards, willing herself to fall asleep so she could implement her plan. Tonight, I'm going to dreamwalk. If her twin Lena could do it with ease, there was a good chance that Gilly had the same mystical talent. However, all she had to go on was her sister's descriptions of how she'd learned to navigate the universe of dreams. She knew it was possible to locate others' dreams, to focus on them once asleep and enter their reveries, but so far, she'd only experienced it from the other side, with her sister finding her dreams. It's time to see if it works for me. Gilly closed her eyes and breathed deeply, focusing on her memories of Phaedra, the wingless fae she'd met at the slave auction on her arrival to Ahriman-Abad. Her plan was to locate the other fae and join forces in the hopes of finding a way out of this hell realm. It took time for sleep to finally claim her, and Gilly found herself wandering a world that reminded her of the Fae Realm at twilight when the stars were starting to appear above the forest, the sky still awash in sunset colors. All around her were twinkling lights like fireflies floating on a sultry summer evening, and beyond the lights, nothing, just colors and twinkling lights going on endlessly in the void around her. She turned around and froze, her eyes going wide. Wings! Why in the web are there wings on my back? Lena had never mentioned wings, but there they were, lacy and golden, and not unlike the ones that grazed Phaedra's back. Gilly flapped them once exploratorily, letting out a sound of glee when they moved as she wished. Flight had always been one of the powers she'd longed for when learning her magic from the crone. She'd even found a spell in one of the old woman's scrolls that promised the caster the ability to swoop like a swallow, but she'd never managed to rise into the sky. The crone had caught her right after casting the spell when she levitated about 2 feet off the floor. The hag, who'd actually been her mother in disguise, had quickly counteracted the spell and forbidden her from casting it again. There was no crone to punish her now, so Gilly took a little run and jumped, flapping her wings and aiming for the skies. Although I can't really tell what's sky and what's not in this place, she noted. It took her a few tries to remain airborne, but before long she was swooping like the swallow she'd hoped to be years ago. That was when she noticed one light shining brighter than the others around it. Gilly floated closer, sensing something familiar about the light. Maybe that's Phaedra's dream, she told herself. Reaching out for it, she took a deep breath and plunged inside. The world around her spun, and she fought a brief sensation of vertigo before landing on her feet. The world went still, and Gilly blinked into this new environment, wondering where she'd wound up. There were noises not far away, the sound of people and the whoosh of something like a river, but it wasn't rhythmic enough to be a moving body of water. Lights flared, and she sensed movement around her, but she was standing within a narrow alley alone. She no longer had even her wings to accompany her, as they seemed to have vanished during the transition into the dream world. Gilly found herself staring at a brick wall and wrinkled her nose. Turning to the side, she saw a metal container larger than she was holding the source of the smell. Moving away from the container and toward the lights in motion, Gilly went to draw on her magic on instinct. The feeling wasn't the same, not quite, but after a moment she managed to blend into the shadow along the wall of the alley. Slowly she inched forward until she came to the end of the alley and peered onto what lay ahead. Gilly's heart beat hard as she took in a landscape she did not understand. Large metal objects whooshed by, propelled by their own power, with glowing eyes to light their way. Figures walked back and forth on either side of the large thoroughfare where the metal monsters roared. Humans! Gilly recognized the species, but she'd never been to their realm before. Is this where humans originate? She turned up her nose. It's loud and chaotic. Give me the Fae Wilds on any day over this place. She scanned the street, looking for any sign of Phaedra, but there was too much happening. Lights flashed on signs above buildings that were bursting with lights, sounds, and people. So many of them crossing and recrossing, chatting and staring at little lighted devices they all seemed to carry in their hands. Gilly found it hard to focus on this world of distractions. Then she found something to focus on. A silhouette dressed in a long, dark coat had crossed in front of the mechanical monsters, who had stopped in line for a reason she couldn't determine. Once on the other side, the silhouette froze, and it looked as if it was sniffing the air, but it was too far away for Gilly to be sure. Something about it gave her a chill. The figure started, then made a beeline for the alley, coming directly toward Gilly. She took a step back, making sure she was blending into the shadows, assuming the figure would pass. She blinked, and when her eyes opened, the figure was standing at the end of the alley, staring at her. Ice blue eyes pierced her. The tall male stared, his nostrils flaring as he took her in. Gilly knew her magic should make her all but invisible in the shadows, but something told her this creature could see her as if in broad daylight. He was handsome in a cold, brutal way. His long brown hair was railed straight and kissed with golden highlights. Gilly didn't think she'd even seen such a pale skin on a creature before. He was unlike any of the humans she'd seen before. Who is he? Before she could ask, he stepped forward and hissed, revealing sharp fangs, a white brighter than his own skin. Gilly gasped, then ran on instinct, receding deeper into the narrow alley. She couldn't outrun the thing, however, because the moment before she reached the blank brick wall at the end of the alley, he appeared in front of her, blocking her path. The living thing can teleport? Gilly scrambled backwards, putting on a burst of Fae speed, hoping to lose the thing among the mechanical monsters beyond. This time she barely skidded to a halt before crashing into him. He teleported into her path again, this time grabbing her arm. His skin was like ice. Gilly looked up into his haunting blue eyes and shivered when he licked a fang in anticipation. Vampire! A vampire's going to kill me in this nightmare of a world, and I'll never wake up! Gilly had never been this afraid. She attempted to pull herself from his grip, but it was like iron, unyielding. Its effect mimicked iron in another way, because when she reached for her Fae powers to blast him away, she felt nothing. Her powers were gone. No! She groaned, regretting her decision to venture into places she'd never gone, places where she didn't know the rules, or the monsters she might find hiding there. You aren't in a position to say no, the vampire drawled in an accent she didn't recognize. You are prey, and I can smell her on you. Now we find out where you've been hiding her. It opened its mouth, fangs glistening, and moved closer, preparing to bite her. Gilly was terrified. She wanted to fight, wanted to run away, wanted to be anywhere but at this creature's mercy, but she couldn't move. Something in his eyes, in the way he spoke, kept her still, kept her compliant, kept her quiet. "Help!" she called out in her mind. "Please, someone help me!" His lips were an inch from her neck when the vampire let out a groan of pain. He staggered backwards, and the distance served to break the spell he had over her. Guilty gasped, and her hand covering her mouth as she noticed the sword protruding from the creature's midsection, covered in dark blood. The vampire fell to his knees, revealing the figure who'd run him through. "Holly!" Gilly cried, his eyes wide and full of confusion. "What's happening?" Holly, her eyes frantic, released her hold on the sword. She rushed to Gilly, grabbing her wrist and yanking her forward. "Run!" Chapter 20. "The wound won't stop him for long," Holly warned, pulling Gilly out of the alley and running in the direction the vampire had come. "We have to find somewhere safe where that thing won't tread." Gilly ran after her, trying to keep up and not get distracted by the chaos all around her. They reached the corner and Holly's head whipped around, checking for an opening before motioning Gilly forward. They stepped into the thoroughfare and Gilly stumbled, the lights of the mechanical monsters blinding her as they bore down on her. "Careful in traffic," Holly shouted, tugging her back to her feet and out of the way as a monster zoomed past with a growl. "If one of these cars hits you, it's lights out." Gilly was relieved when they'd passed the cars, as Holly had called them, and were back among the masses. There was a loud squeal and then the sound like a goose if it were 10 times larger and very angry. Gilly covered her sensitive ears and looked back to see what was causing the commotion. The vampire was walking toward them, all signs of the sword and his wound having vanished. "Come on!" Holly yelled, more steel in her tone than Gilly had heard from her yet. They picked up speed, rushing down the lane, avoiding humans who looked annoyed or faintly afraid. Every time she looked over her shoulder, she saw the vampire behind them. She knew that any moment he could appear in front of them, cutting them off. So why is he following after us like this? He's toying with us, she realized when she saw his toothy grin. Holly grabbed her hand again and pulled her up a set of stone steps to a large wooden door. Yanking it open, she propelled Gilly inside and then closed the door after them. Gilly took a few steps inside, marveling at the building they just entered. Just past the entranceway, the structure widened into a massive chamber with steep ceilings and rows of wooden benches. Candles burned on several surfaces scattered around the perimeter of the room, and in the front stood a dais, on which there was what looked to be a large stone table with candles in golden stands flanking it. Behind it was a tall window that had been painted with a scene of shining figures Gilly didn't recognize. "Hurry!" Holly called. "To the altar!" She pointed to the front of the chamber, then took off running down the wide aisle between the benches. Gilly followed, feeling strange in the hush of the chamber after the loud noises of outside. The drama of the dream had caught her up entirely, and she no longer remembered that she wasn't in the waking world. Holly came to a stop near the stone table, where she approached a bronze statue of an angel. Gilly had seen images of angels in the crone's library. The wings and beatific look are a dead giveaway. In the angel's hands was a round stone bowl, filled with a clear liquid. "This is holy water," Holly said, reaching into a pocket to pull out a small vial. "This will keep the fiend away." There was a loud crack, and their heads lifted to look back in the direction they'd come. The door to the outside stood open, and outside, on the doorstep, stood the vampire, anger clear in the lines of his body. Fear filled her, and Gilly swallowed hard, feeling overwhelmed by what had so quickly happened. "We should be safe in here," Holly told her, but from the quaver in her voice, Gilly wasn't certain the human believed her own words. "Take this!" She thrust the vial into Gilly's hands, then began filling another for herself. When she dunked the vial into the liquid, the white bowl suddenly cracked, the contents dumping onto the floor below. "No!" Holly cried in frustration. Her eyes flicked to the leech, a scowl on her face. "You can't hurt me here!" Gilly heard his chuckle as clearly as if he was standing beside her, even though he was yards away at the entrance. He had not yet crossed over the threshold, which made Gilly wonder if maybe he wasn't able to. Maybe that's why she believes he can't hurt us while we're inside. "You can't hide from me, dumpling. When will you learn that?" His accented words floated into Gilly's ear, and she could see that Holly had heard them too. Her scowl faltered, fear crossing her features. "I will follow you anywhere, hunt you down anywhere. There is no escaping destiny." At those words, the ground beneath them began to shake. The chandeliers above began to swing, and the walls were moving enough for some of the wall hangings to collapse. Holly stumbled and Gilly grabbed her, holding on to the angel's statue to remain upright. There was a sharp sound from behind them, and Gilly craned her head around to see the large windows start to crack. The lines of the cracks traced higher and higher, widening until the entire window shattered with a loud crash, the glass careening to the floor. Both women screamed, and the vampire laughed. I may not be able to enter, but I will tear this building down around you to get to you. Her fright threatened to overwhelm her, like a swimmer lost at sea, tiring of fighting against the waves. How is this happening? How did I even get here? Gilly struggled to recall where she'd been before the alley and how she'd ended up with these humans. Humans and one very peevish vampire, her mind corrected. Wings and fireflies? The words entered her mind and Gilly froze, her memory returning. This is a dream. I'm dreaming. No, Holly is dreaming. I've traveled into Holly's dream by mistake. In looking for the Fae, she'd accidentally stumbled into her human companion's dream. At least I was close. So if this is a dream, then I can't be helpless. The conclusion came to her upon remembering the nightmare she'd experienced at the hands of the Dev when he was trying to punish her for meeting her sister in the dream world without informing him. When she'd woken up, she'd thought she was still dreaming, but Solomon had informed her that she'd shattered the dream. That meant she could return to the waking world, the nightmare banished at any time. Sounds like the leech isn't the one in charge here, she told herself, standing up straighter. Don't worry, I've got this, she said, pushing up her sleeves before holding out both hands. The magic inside her roared to life, the limitations imposed by the vampire's will in the dream evaporating. Does it even matter if I'm using my magical powers in the dream? She wondered. Or can I just think a thing and make it so? Although the power simmered inside her, she took a second to test her theory. Stop the shaking! The moment she thought the words, the structure became still. Holly looked at her, eyes wide. What's happening? We're not going to run from the vamp anymore, Gilly replied, her tone firm. It's time to turn the tables on our pursuer. Let's see how he likes it. Hey, leech, she called out, making the vampire hiss in anger. You've got 2 seconds to get the hells out of here before you meet your cursed maker. The vampire chuckled at his tone, unimpressed. What are you going to do? Throw that useless water on me? You're only making things worse for yourself. I don't need water to destroy you, Gilly replied. All I need is to shed some light on the situation. She closed her eyes and envisioned a sunrise, instant and bright. When she opened her eyes again, light was already spilling through the shattered window. The sun flashed to life in the sky, and the vampire hissed, his face filled with horror. A moment later, his form was replaced by a white mist that quickly faded, leaving no trace of the leech behind. You did it! Holly shouted, jumping into the air. She hugged Gilly, almost giddy with her victory. I don't know how you did it, but you drove him away. Nothing's impossible for a woman with the right amount of determination, she replied with a laugh. What are you doing here? Holly asked jerkily, still suffering from the adrenaline rush of the chase. How did you end up on Earth? Earth? Is that what the human realm is called? Sort of, Holly said, tittering at her pronunciation. But answer my questions. I've never seen a fairy in our world. Well, none that are real anyway. Well, technically that is still true because I'm not really here right now. Or here isn't exactly here right now. Gilly squinted an eye and tilted her head. Here isn't real. Holly put a hand on her arm, concern filling her features. Are you all right? Did that vampire do something to your brain? Should we call an ambulance? Sorry, I'm explaining this terrible. Gilly took her by the arm and led her over to a bench, settling Holly beside her. This isn't real because we're in a dream right now. Your dream, or your nightmare, to be more precise. I have the ability to walk between dreams, and while looking for Phaedra, I found your dream instead. This is a dream? Holly shook her head, then let out a long breath. That makes sense. Even when my daytime life is a nightmare, I still manage to dream of him every night. Him? The vampire? Gilly remembered Holly's confession about a vampire stalking her, claiming she was his eternal mate. Is that the one you're... Don't say it, Holly said, rushing to cover Gilly's mouth. He's not my anything. I want him to stop following me, except maybe he has. She stared up at the cracked ceiling with a look of confusion. "They're my dreams, right? I'm conjuring him up myself, unless—" She sat up straighter, clutching at Gilly's robes. "Maybe he can walk through dreams, too." Relief filled her face. "Maybe he is coming for me in my dreams, and it's not my own imagination that puts him there every night." "Maybe," Gilly said, patting her comfortingly. "That makes as much sense as anything else does." Holly slumped against the bench, all the tension leaving her. "Either way, if he comes back, I'll take a page from your book and banish him, if I can figure out how." "It's your dream," Gilly reminded her. "You're in control." "Thanks," Holly said, beaming. She started. "Wait, you didn't say what you're doing here. Why are you looking for Phaedra's dream?" "I'm desperate. Are you still on Aramon?" "Aramon? Is that what this horrible desert world we're trapped on is called?" Gilly nodded. "Right. So you're still here." "Unfortunately. Not for lack of trying, though. Phaedra is phenomenal. She knows of an incantation that she can cast that will take us to her realm. We've been gathering ingredients, but it hasn't been easy. Once she's ready, she'll complete this ritual and we'll be transported away." Holly shook her head. "I would have never believed in teleportation and incantations, but having a vampire try to claim you as his mate can really change a girl's perspective." "Try going head-to-head with a dev," Gilly commiserated. "If Phaedra has found a way off-world, I want to ride along. Can you tell me where you are so I can make my way to you?" "I'm the worst person to ask this question," Holly confided. "I can't even read a map." "You have a map?" Gilly asked, perking up. "I haven't come close to a map. Can you relate it to me? Maybe Solomon can figure out where you are." "I don't have a map, Gilly, but if I did, I couldn't read it. That's what I meant, but I know we're sleeping in a cave about an hour away from a town that uses a dragon-breathing fire as its symbol." "That's got to be good enough," Gilly said, hiding her disappointment at the lack of details. "I'll come find you as soon as I can. I'll try to come back to your dream tomorrow if I won't be able to reach you in a day." Holly nodded, then leaned over to hug her. "You're a survivor, Gilly. We'll make it out. Don't worry." Gilly hugged her back tightly. "I never worry," she said, pulling away and giving Holly a wink. "See you in your dreams." Concentrating hard for a moment, Gilly woke herself up. Chapter 21. She blinked into the early morning sunlight that peeked through the slits of the drapes. Rising and stretching, she gathered her meager belongings, washed her face, and headed into the hallway. Gilly expected to find Solomon still asleep, but his door was open. Stepping into the doorway, she looked in to see him loading provisions into his pack. He glanced up at her, his expression neutral. "You look well-rested," she told him. "I feel well-rested," he admitted. "It was nice to take one night off of being chased or attacked or cheated. How are you faring this morning?" "I'm faring well, actually." Gilly sat on his bed, pushing aside a few cloth bags filled with food items to make room. "I had a very interesting dream last night." She related to him the scene with Holly and the revelation that she and Phaedra were somewhere close to a town with a dragon for a mascot. "Asdar," Solomon told her, naming the town in question. "It's on the western front." "Then you know where it is," the dev nodded. "It's several days' walk from the estate, but we may be able to make it before the prince catches wind of us." Gilly blinked up at him. She hadn't asked him to accompany her, not sure how he would feel about continuing their journey together. Part of her had considered compelling him to come through the silver ring he still wore, but that no longer felt like an option. "If he suggests we go our separate ways, I will release him from my control." "So you'll come with me of your own volition?" "You're giving me a choice?" he said, taken aback. "That must have been some dream." Gilly gave a mirthless laugh. "I know I've been dragging you from place to place without your consent, and although you did the same to me when I arrived, I will apologize, especially for forcing you to come here." She leaned back against the headboard, trying to open up to him as much as a natural reticence would allow. "I never should have forced you to confront your past, and even though things seem to have come out okay, it wasn't right of me to demand that of you." "You were right," he said after a moment. "I shouldn't have ignored the needs of the people of Deep Sands. I shouldn't have left them under my brother's thumb for so long. I had a duty to them, and it was unfulfilled for too long." Gilly was surprised to hear him say that. Still, No one should have had to face what you did, and for my part in it, I'm sorry. So yes, you have a choice. If you say we should go our separate ways, I'll agree and kindly ask you for directions." Solomon held up his hand. "And the silver ring? Does it stay in place when I depart?" Gilly looked at him for a moment, and in that moment she hesitated. There was the sound of footsteps coming in their direction, and she used it as an excuse to not answer. "Someone's coming." It turned out to be Mace. The wizard looked 10 years younger today, as if the weight of the world no longer rested on his back. "Good morrow, my lord and lady." "Lady?" Gilly squeaked, while Solomon cocked an eyebrow at the wizard, shaking his head. The old man laughed, his staff rocking along with his mirth. Then he caught sight of the packets of bread, cheese, and nuts that were left on the bed, and his smile faded. "Are you going somewhere, sire?" "Call me Solomon," the dev replied gently. "And I cannot stay, Mace. This place is no longer my home." The wizard looked confused. "But it is. You're now the Lord of Deep Sands, protector of the inner desert, the Hammer of the Wastes." "I thought it was the Hammer of the Dunes," Gilly interrupted, recalling the name she'd heard applied to him before and crossing her arms. Solomon rolled his eyes. "I may have taken the Hammer of part from my father's official title and changed it to suit my position in the Dune Sea." "You can't go," Mace said, tugging on Solomon's sleeve. "Who will protect us? As soon as word gets out that Saeed is dead and you've gone, what's to stop the gods loyal to Saeed from coming back and taking over, or any group of roving marauders who gets wind of our situation? They'll take this land for themselves and litter it with our corpses." "That's not exactly true," Solomon said gently. "The rightful possessor of Deep Sands has protective powers over them. My brother, for instance, was altered when anyone entered the borders of the estate. Only he could give permission for the dungeon to open, and he controlled the sands from which our powers are derived." "But you'll be taking those powers with you," Mace pointed out, "leaving us helpless." "On the contrary, I'm giving those powers to you." The wizard's mouth dropped open, his eyes wide with shock. Or fear. "Turning the magic of Deep Sands over to a lowly wizard, it's unheard of." "I'm turning the magic of the Deep Sands over to Mace Marauder's Bane, Lord of Deep Sands, Hammer of the Wastes, and protector of his people." Mace's eyes misted, and his hands began to tremble. "My lord, that is—" Gilly pushed off the bed and came to put an arm around the old man. She gave him a soft smile and squeezed his shoulder. "You deserve this, Mace, and your people need you." "Thank you," he said, his breath hitching. "I will not fail them." Solomon gave him a solemn nod. "Then, all that is left is the ceremony. Gather the remaining residents of Deep Sands in the courtyard. I'll be there directly to perform the transfer ritual." "Transfer ritual?" Gilly asked, intrigued. Solomon's cheeks tinged pink. "There's no real ritual required. I assume the powers on my brother's death as the last of the bloodline, but I can give them to another through a simple touch and the will to do so. But I think Mace deserves a little pomp and circumstance, don't you?" Gilly nodded, thinking she'd never been more infatuated with the dev than in that moment. The suns were well above the horizon by the time they made their way off the estates, cheered on by the people of Deep Sands and a tearful wizard who'd just been promoted to lord. It had been a moving ceremony, and Solomon had read the mood just right. He was setting the stage for a new era on the estate, leaving a unique legacy as he said goodbye to his birthright and the people who would remain. They'd been walking for about an hour when Gilly asked Solomon to slow his steps. "This heat is ungodly," she said, wiping her brow for the 100th time. "How is it so much hotter here than even the dunes?" "We're in the inner desert now. It has never rained here, not one drop. The land is barren and cracked, and water is a priceless commodity. You need tremendous strength to survive a trek through the wastes." "And yet your family estate was not this unmanageable," she complained. "Why is it so much worse now?" "Deep Sands is where it is because it's the only place in the inner desert where it could survive. We're in a natural valley on the border of a very slow-moving and thick river, but with enough water to support life. The tall hills around us block some of the day's heat as well, helping to reduce the temperature." Why anyone would venture out into the middle of this wasteland and found in his state, I don't understand.
There are benefits to being in the middle of nowhere, Solomon mused. For instance, no close neighbors.
Gilly laughed. What happens if you need to borrow an egg or a cup of milk?
You raid the coop or milk the beast. That deep in the desert, you must be self-sufficient, or you won't survive long.
Solomon started to walk again, his shadow small behind him. Gilly groaned as she followed suit. I wish there was some way to go faster. At this rate, I'll be a shriveled up old woman by the time we find Phaedra and Holly. What if they leave without me?
I'm sorry to say, but there is no quicker way to pass through the wastes, unless you can catch one of those mythical dragons Astar is famous for.
Raising her head to heaven, she let out a pitiful cry. I'm so tired of this leafing realm. Then she saw something hurling toward her. Just before it smacked into her face, Solomon caught it, his brow furrowing. A rope!
Hello, friends, came a voice from above.
Gilly tilted her head to see the spirit ship floating above them. Its shadow was behind them, and it had crept up without a sound. Virgil Ross had peered over the side, and he waved a hand. Care for a ride? What are you doing here? Gilly called up to him. Are you some kind of telepathic necromancer?
Wouldn't that be a fanciful combination? He yelled back. Actually, I ran into a very angry ghost who looked a lot like Solomon. Said his name was Saeed. He told quite a tale before I was forced to use him for fuel and jettison him. I hear Solomon has done a great injustice to his family's honor.
Solomon's expression was black, but Gilly couldn't hold back a chuckle. We're climbing up so you can hear the real story. Solomon shook his head, but Gilly had already jumped onto the rope. Come on, it's got to be faster to fly than to walk. Once they were settled on the deck of the spirit ship, Gilly filled Virgil in on the story, spinning it as the redemption tale Solomon deserved. Roth nodded along. That Saeed fellow didn't seem very trustworthy to me, and mutinies don't happen in a vacuum. Solomon ignored their conversation, instead looking out over the side of the boat as the bleakness passed them by at a rapid speed.
How is your companion holding up?
Virgil asked softly, leaning in. It's hard to say, she glanced in the dev's direction, hoping they wouldn't be overheard. I don't think he regrets what happened in the end, although being forced to go through something like that must take a toll. The necromancer shook his head. I almost wish I could accompany you to see what trouble you two get into next. You're a magnet for adventure. I'm tired of adventure, she responded, shaking her hands as if trying to get whatever intrinsic quality drew calamitous events out of her through the motions. I miss the trees back home. Virgil peered over her shoulder, lost in thought. Home is where the heart is. He glanced back at her. I heard a human say that once. Funny creatures, humans. Their lives are so short, but they feel so deeply, always waxing poetic about something. Gilly looked at him, thinking his aside about humans was meant to disguise a moment of vulnerability. My home is where my family is, one I fought to unite. I won't abandon them now, so soon after I found them.
A story for another time, I'm afraid. Virgil stood, returning to his position at the wheel. We're about to make the turn to Asdar, but I do hope to meet you another time, he said, loud enough for the dev to hear.
Solomon turned away from the expansive view and moved closer to Gilly to hover protectively. Any annoyance she might have felt before was replaced by the warmth of knowing that he cared about her, regardless of the power dynamics at play in their relationship. Before long, she could see the town in the distance. It was built around a hill, with a square citadel at its center. On the top of the citadel's peak roof stood a shining statue of a dragon. A moment after she caught sight of it, the statue blasted a spurt of fire from its mouth, startling her. Solomon chuckled. I didn't realize you were so jumpy, he teased. It's just a little fire. Worried you can't take the heat? Gilly fought a blush at his words, knowing they had a double meaning. She followed Roth when he left the wheel to toss his rope over the side. He offered her a hand, smiling down at her as she climbed. Until next time, Gilly of the Fae. Maybe not, she replied with a laugh. No offense, but I would rather get off this world, so I hope we don't have to meet again. Perhaps on another world, then, he replied, then moved back as Solomon gave him a murderous stare. The dev followed her over the side, and they climbed swiftly down the rope, dropping to the ground near to a ridge of rocky hills a few miles outside the town. It isn't even sunset yet, and we've made it all the way to Asdar, Gilly clapped. You might not like that necromancer, but I have to admit, he's growing on me. Maybe we should hire him as our personal transport service." Solomon's mouth was turned down at the corners, and he mumbled something under his breath. Gilly ignored him, waving to Virgil as he made a wide turn back over the ridge to avoid getting too close to the town and attracting attention. She turned back to the dev, hands on her hips. "Well, shall we walk into town or look for—" Her words cut out at the sight of a blurred shape rushing in their direction from a rock outcropping. Before she could react, it collided with Solomon, knocking the dev to the ground. Virgil was right. Trouble is attracted to us like a magnet. She summoned her powers, ready to fight whatever the hell world threw at them next. Chapter 22. The blow was back, landing a flurry of blows on the surprised dev. Gilly focused her magic, about to throw lightning at the creature. Then she noticed the wings and froze. "Phaedra!" Solomon let out a roar and tossed the Fae aside. Phaedra tumbled to the dirt, then sprang up again, holding out her hands and sending a burst of purple energy in the dev's direction. It hit him in the chest, and he dropped, groaning in agony. "Stop!" Gilly called, waving the other Fae down. "He's not going to hurt you."
"This abomination enslaved us,"
Phaedra cried, then shocked him again. Her expression was feral. With her Fae powers unleashed, she was a truly formidable foe. "I'm not enslaved anymore," Gilly insisted. "And he helped me escape the Prince of Darkness. He's on our side now."
"This thing is on our side."
Phaedra looked as if she wanted to spit on him. Instead, she turned back to Gilly, seething with anger.
"What makes you so sure he isn't just playing you, waiting to betray you when the circumstances would benefit him?"
"Because there is no benefit in going against the prince. He controls this realm with an iron fist, and defying him came at a great personal peril." Phaedra shook her head.
"You don't get it, do you? He's the enemy, the ancient enemy, and there is no redeeming a beast like him."
When Gilly tried to convince her otherwise, the Fae shook her head.
"What's keeping him from slitting our throats while we sleep?"
"This!" Gilly shouted finally, grabbing Solomon's arm and yanking it out to display his splayed hands. "See that ring? That means I'm in control." The black look vanished from Phaedra's face to be replaced with an expression of pure glee.
"You did it!"
She pulled Gilly into a loose embrace, patting her on the back. "I wasn't sure you had it in you, but girl, I am impressed. Now that you know he's not a threat, will you call off your attack?" Gilly hadn't expected this little hiccup. "It doesn't hurt to have an extra pair of hands on our side in this dangerous environment."
"Walk with me,"
Phaedra said, putting her arm around Gilly and heading in the direction of the rocky outcropping from whence she'd come. "I've heard of victims of slavery who become attached to their masters, even after they're freed, then try to return to a life of exploitation to please this master who has never seen them as anything more than a possession. I think something similar may have happened to you during your time with the dev." Gilly looked over her shoulder to see Solomon keeping pace several feet behind them. "That's not exactly what's happened here. He enslaved me. I've enslaved him. At this point, we're pretty much even. So if you're going to call him guilty for his crime, you've got to convict me of the same." Phaedra pondered her words, then gave a brief nod.
"I understand what you're saying and respect your perspective. But the dev and I are far from even. I do not forgive those who cross me so easily."
She flapped her wings a few times in irritation.
"We'll be out of this realm soon enough. Time to cut the dead weight."
"Then you're ready. You have all the ingredients." A burst of excitement went off inside her, followed immediately by guilt at the thought of tossing Solomon aside so soon.
"Only one left to go," Phaedra said, "and it's close."
"How close?" Gilly was a ball of attention, feeling the closest she'd been to getting away from Aramon for good.
"It's said to be in this rock formation, but I haven't been able to locate it,"
Phaedra grumbled.
"And the human, while pleasant, is fairly useless at most things."
"Where is Holly?" Gilly asked, shading her eyes to look around. "I haven't seen her since we landed."
She's tucked into a cave covered by a spell of protection. As I said, she's for the most part useless. She couldn't even defend herself from a child Fae with a toy bow."
Gilly looked over her shoulder again. The dev was staring back at her. She faced forward once more. "You know, Solomon knows just about everything about this realm. He figured out the town you were near with very little description. I bet he can tell you where your last ingredient is hiding."
"Gilly,"
Phaedra said, her tone a warning.
"Stop trying to find reasons for that monster to stick around. Cut him loose, or better yet, let me cut his throat."
If we're going to get off-world, we're going to have to work together, Gilly said, her tone just as fierce. And that means laying off the dev unless you want to find yourself with a second smile 3 inches below the first one. They reached the shade of the rocks, and Phaedra ducked out of sight, turning sideways and disappearing into a slender crack in the rock face. Solomon pulled up next to Gilly, leaning against the stone. She's not going to accept me, he said. It's written in every line of her body. Gilly let out a slow breath of air. I'm working on her. But it would help if you provided a reason to keep you around, like aiding her in finding the final ingredient needed for the ritual. Phaedra reappeared, this time with Holly in tow. The human let out a squeal of delight and embraced Gilly, rocking her back and forth in her excitement.
I can't believe you found us already. I woke up this morning half thinking I'd dreamed it all. Well, I had dreamed it all, but you know what I mean.
I do, Gilly said, smiling and pulling away. She rubbed her hands together, making eye contact with each person in the loose huddle. Now, how about that final ingredient, ladies? What are we looking for? Phaedra gave her an annoyed stare, then let out a huff.
I need the milk of a mother. It's supposed to be somewhere in this area. She looked over at the dev. Do you know of it?
I do. But it would be suicide to go after it. Solomon's moderate tone sounded truthful. The milk of the mother is guarded by the mother herself, a fearsome beast who will slaughter every single one of us without mercy. Hooray, Gilly said in a high-pitched voice laced with good-natured sarcasm. The thing we need is guarded by some terrible creature. Solomon let out a groan. What is it about you, Fae? Any time I point out danger, you choose to run straight for it. I think the question we should be asking is, why does danger lurk around every corner in this bloody awful world you inhabit? Gilly asked, her tone taut.
Make him lead us to the milk of the mother, Phaedra said directly. Let's stop wasting time. The sooner won, the sooner done. Did I mention I was claustrophobic? Yes, Holly, Phaedra said.
There were signs in her tone that her patience was wearing thin.
4 times already. And I told you that I don't know what that word means. It's a fear of close spaces. It's just that the path we're walking on keeps getting narrower and tighter. It makes it hard for me to breathe in a place so small. I feel like I might pass out. Humans, the Fae huffed to Gilly. Whoever thought there would be so many things to be frightened of?
They were within the rocky ridge, traversing a tunnel of rock lit by the glowing bodies of Gilly and Phaedra. Fae produced light naturally when needed, pouring out of their pores on demand. The path they were on was naturally formed, according to Solomon. This network of caves is the result of eons of slow-moving water that has since all but dried up. What little is left belongs to the mother, the dev had told him before. Phaedra insulted his intelligence. She'd been doing that a lot, along with other insults. It was clear the Fae did not forgive easily. Gilly hurried to intercede, but it was a struggle to keep the peace between the two of them as tempers heated up. Solomon came to a stop, turning back to face the women following behind him. Once again, I must strongly urge you to turn back now. I know that it feels like you can't wait to get out of this realm another minute, but there are other means at your disposal. Less deadly means. We can try Asdar. See if we can round up a demon trustworthy enough to teleport you. Phaedra jerked her chin at Gilly, making her sigh. Solomon, lead us to the milk of the mother, won't you? She pulsed a little magical energy into the silver ring to make certain he obeyed. The dev grit his teeth, every muscle in his body flexing in an attempt to countermand her order. It was a valiant effort, but the silver won out in the end. He turned, his shoulders slumping, and brought them into a chamber that quickly widened until the ceiling soared out of sight over their heads because it was out of range of the Fae's light. What is this place? Gilly asked, readying her powers in case of an ambush attack from an unseen enemy. This is where you asked me to bring you, he answered, his voice soft. Just ahead you'll find the milk of the mother, he pointed in front of him, and Phaedra pushed her way around him, venturing forward and illuminating more of the cavern as she went. A few steps later she paused.
There's a pool here,
she said, bending low to get closer.
It does look like milk. Be careful, Holly called out, biting her knuckles. This place gives me the creeps.
That makes 2 of us, Gilly said, her head swiveling back and forth, perpetually scanning for danger. The walls that surrounded them were smooth and reflective, causing eerie displays as their light reflected off the white water of the pool. The Dev was tense, stepping from one foot to the other, clearly anticipating an attack. It only served to make Gilly even more nervous. Her eyes fastened onto Phaedra, willing the Fae with her mind to hurry the hells up. Phaedra pulled a vial from her pack and carefully placed it in the water, causing as little disturbance as possible. She straightened, holding the vial up to make certain she had the supplies she needed. Turning around, the Fae gave a confident smile and a wave. Phaedra took one step in their direction, then froze, as a horrible keening sound rent the silence. It echoed around the chamber, making Gilly cover her eyes and wince in pain. There was the sound of water splashing, and her eyes went to pool. A shiny black tentacle, thick as a large man's thigh, was slowly rising from the milk-white waters. Gilly stared at it. Dread, coupled with a sick sense of acceptance, cuddled together in her gut. We all knew this would happen, and yet we came anyway. "We need to get out of here, now!" Solon beckoned frantically at the Fae, who was slowly turning around to face what lay behind her. The tentacle tip reached the ceiling and doubled back slowly, pausing as if to sniff the air. There was something hungry about it, and Gilly felt her stomach drop. Phaedra set off at a run, but her movement attracted notice. The tentacle snapped forward in her direction, slamming itself into her path. The force of the blow made the cavern shiver. Gilly's eyes shot from ceiling to wall to floor as the sound of tumbling rocks echoed in every direction. "Get out of here!" Solomon ordered, shoving Holly into Gilly's arms. "Run! Now!" Gilly did not hesitate. Taking the human's arm, she rushed forward as fast as Holly's feet would allow. Glancing over her shoulder, she watched as Solomon pulled out his warhammer and leapt at the tentacle that was barreling toward Phaedra. He slammed his hammer down, making the tentacle recoil. It flicked upwards, slamming into the ceiling and sending tremors through the cave walls. There was a horrible cracking sound, and Gilly looked up to see it rushing out in front of her and splitting into three before it came crashing down. She skidded to a halt before the rocks from the ceiling slammed down in front of her, blocking her path. Coughing from the dust and debris, she blinked ahead to see that fallen rocks blocked the tunnel. Her only exit, Gilly realized, turning back slowly to put an arm around Holly, who was trembling with fear. "Stay here," Gilly said, stashing Holly under one of the fallen rocks that she hoped would give the fragile human some protection. "If we survive this, I'll come back for you."
"If we survive, wait!"
Holly called, but Gilly turned her back on the human, letting her magic fill her while she sized up their adversary. Their only option to get out was to fight, it seemed. Once more into battle, Gilly thought, and realized that a part of her was enjoying this. With a feral smile, she threw herself into the maelstrom that was about to happen. Chapter 23. The first tentacle was soon joined by another, then one more and another, until 4 tentacles waved at them, their pale suckers pulsing open and closed as they towered above them. Gilly stood beside Solomon, fire crackling at her fingertips. "Why doesn't it attack again?" she whispered to the Dev, who was tracing the tentacle's motions as if there were a pattern to its movements that she was missing. "It can't see. That first strike was to shake us up, to reveal our locations, but my blow scrambled its systems enough that it isn't sure where we were, which is why the mother sent backup." "Why doesn't it surface then?" Gilly asked, confused, then shook her head. "We're leafing lucky it doesn't. If it could see us, we'd be done for." "The pool isn't large enough for the creature to surface. No one is certain how large it is, nor how many appendages it boasts. Some say it fills the vast underwater caverns that run underneath this ridge. Its body is deep underwater, so the mother relies on vibrations sensed by those nasty little suckers. She's waiting for us to move around enough to get a bead on us so she can strike. So if we stay still enough, she might give up and go away." Gilly's words were cut off when the tentacle snapped forward with the speed of a diving bird of prey to encircle Phaedra's waist. The Fae had strayed too far forward, the motion alerting the creature to her presence. The tentacle squeezed tighter, and Phaedra let out a groan before shoving her hands against 2 of the sticky white suckers and releasing a blast of magical energy into each of them. The tentacle pulsated, then released her, dropping back into the water. Phaedra, a scowl on her face, wasn't the type to wait for another attack. The Fae preferred being on the offensive. She let out a roar of rage, waves of fire shooting from her open palms into the water.
"I'm going to boil you alive!"
The mother had other ideas. The tentacle that had fled in the face of her attack was replaced by its brethren as Gilly watched 2 more erupt from the water, their appearance bringing about a change in the creature's behavior. The black limbs began to rotate in a circular path around the pool, creating a wheel of brute force. One slapped into the Fae mid-air, knocking her to the ground. Gilly rushed to her side, leaping over and ducking under the tentacles that whipped around her. Relieved to hear a groan that let her know the Fae was still alive, she skidded to a halt and crouched to the ground, rolling Phaedra over. "You're okay?" The Fae blinked up at her, then grinned, her teeth coated in blood.
"I'm down, but I'm not out."
"Ladies," Solomon warned from his position, "I think they're planning something. You may want to—" Whatever the dev had been about to say was lost to history. A brutal smacking sound rang through the cavern, followed by a howl of agony from Solomon, who was flung across the chamber and into the cave wall. He crumpled to the ground, dropping his hammer and going limp. Gilly restrained herself from running to him, not able to waste precious seconds on ascertaining whether the dev was still alive. "Get down!" Phaedra shouted and ducked, a tentacle whooshing past her in the place her head had been a moment before. The other Fae leapt into the air, her wings fluttering as she dove toward one of the tentacles, her burst of cold wind coming from her hands. One of the whipping tentacles stopped in its tracks, ice covering its tip and rapidly working its way down until it was frozen solid in less than 2 seconds. Gilly crawled to her feet and watched the scene. It seemed like time slowed down as the tentacle behind the frozen one continued forward along its circular route. It couldn't stop its momentum in time and crashed into its frozen brother, smashing away some of the ice while knocking the tentacle down. Although most of the massive appendage splashed into the water, the last several feet, including its frozen tip, slammed into the cave floor, slipping backwards toward the pool. It flopped over mindlessly, and in its rolling, the tentacle managed to catch against Gilly's leg. She'd been standing still, hoping to avoid its perception, but hadn't expected the sudden flop. As soon as the tentacle touched her, its suckers attached to the skin on her legs, causing a painful burning sensation. "Let go!" Gilly grunted, attempting to free it, but the sucker was stuck fast. The tentacle confirmed its backwards descent toward the pool, its own dead weight propelling it. She was yanked off her feet, her back hitting the hard rocky ground. Gilly struggled to turn herself over, but the tentacle was too heavy. She tried grabbing at something, anything, as the tentacle dragged her forward. The white water was rushing toward her. Gilly dug her fingernails into the rock, but they could not find enough purchase, and a moment later she was dragged under the surface of the pond. A shock of cold hit her body, and she focused on holding her breath. Blinking through the murky water, Gilly remembered the shock Phaedra had delivered to the other tentacle suckers that caused it to release her. Maybe I can pull off the same thing. Twisting in the water, she bent to place her hands against 2 suckers that were rapidly opening and closing. Channeling a hard shock through her palms, she released the energy into the creature, making it twitch like a fish on dry land. She was able to pull her leg away, freeing herself, and immediately struggled toward the surface. She could see the glowing light emitted by the other Fae's body beyond the waving surface. A moment away from bursting through to the air above, she was yanked violently from below. Looking down, Gilly could see the tip of a tentacle wrapped around her ankle. Kicking her legs vigorously, she swam for all she was worth, hoping to fight her way to the surface, but the tentacle was so much stronger than she, and Gilly found herself being dragged down deeper into the murky water. She blinked her eyes, relieved to find the water clearing. Visibly increased, thanks to her glowing body, Gilly looked around frantically for some means of escaping, her lungs starting to burn as she was pulled into the depths, tentacles surrounding her. The situation was increasingly hopeless. Her eyes casting about for any means of escape, she noticed a tunnel branching off that was free of tentacles. I could swim for it, hide inside and wait out the attack, but my lungs would likely give out long before they retreat. That's an impossible situation. No, she thought, her anger multiplying, giving her a burst of energy. I'm not giving up yet. I didn't come all this way to go to a watery grave. A second away from giving into her panic, she bent over to dig her nails into the tentacle, ripping and tearing at it with all her strength. One more vicious kick and she was free. Spots were appearing before her eyes, and she knew she'd be out of breath soon. With every ounce of energy remaining in her, she propelled herself upward, but the surface was so far away, her eyes started to slide closed, the cold numbing her limbs. Hope was fading with her body warmth. and Gilly was confronted with her own demise. She'd failed to accomplish what she'd hoped to, losing the opportunity to get to know her family. The only bright spot would be that Solomon would be free of the control his silver ring gave her. "Live well," she thought, then remembered his crumpled form and added, "if you're still alive." A sudden commotion in the water caused her to open her eyes. Rushing down from the surface, her lacy wings beating behind her, Phaedra dove swiftly toward Gilly with arms outstretched. Gilly kicked toward her, grabbing her hand, and Phaedra pulled her into an embrace. Her wings better than any fins, Phaedra flapped them, pushing them rapidly to the surface. Gilly gulped at the air, her lungs on fire. She paddled fitfully with Phaedra's aid. She managed to pull herself out onto the shore. "It's hopeless," she gasped, pulling herself to her feet. "Those tentacles could go for miles, and there are several more down there. Solomon was right. We shouldn't have come here."
"I hate to say it, but I told you so."
Her head shot up at the dev's voice. It seemed Solomon was still drawing air. Relief renewed her strength, and she hugged him tightly. He let out a groan of pain. "Careful! I'm pretty sure I have a couple broken ribs." "Sorry," she said, releasing him and turning her attention to the tentacles that continued to whip and whir around them. With what remained of her magical energy, she lifted her hands, her eyes flashing silver, and rained lightning from the ceiling. Bolts arched toward each of the tentacles, rattling them with electric blasts. A few went limp, others shaking it off, but even with one of her most powerful attacks, there was little sign of any damage. "We can't kill it," Solomon muttered, shaking his head, "and we can't escape the way we came. It might be time to pray to whatever gods you worship for safe passage into the afterlife." Gilly could feel defeat closing in. An idea popped into her head. It was a long shot, but it was better than what they were up against. As the tentacles picked themselves back up and readied their next attack, she made a snap decision. "Get in the water," she said, pointing back the way they'd come. "There's an underwater tunnel, one not yet infested by tentacles. It's our only chance." "What chance do we have? You said there were more of those things down there," Solomon replied. But Phaedra didn't argue. She rushed in the direction of the debris where Holly was stashed. Returning in a flash, she nodded to Gilly. "Ready?" "I'll lead the way." Filling her lungs with air, she dove beneath the surface, narrowly avoiding the slap of a passing tentacle. A splash to her left let her know that Phaedra had followed. Her arms wrapped around Holly. Her wings flapped, sending her forward, and Gilly swam with all her might, not able to wait to see if Solomon followed after her. Her swimming skills were tested when a tentacle shot in her direction, but she managed to evade it. Catching onto a large rock right outside the side tunnel, she pulled herself into it, her glowing body illuminating the passage. It continued on with no end in sight. Phaedra pushed past her wings outpacing Gilly. The Fae wasn't waiting for anyone, and Gilly struggled to keep up. "This has got to go somewhere, or why led us to our deaths?" She could feel the burn starting in her lungs and kicked harder, swimming close to the rocky wall of the tunnel. Kicking off the wall gave her an extra boost, until her foot got caught in the crack between two rocks. Panic exploded in her brain. Gilly bent to try and free herself, but her jerky motions failed and her lungs started to ache. "I'm going to die here, trapped beneath the surface to rot, at least until one of those tentacles finds me and carries me back to the mother's mouth." A pair of hands appeared on her calves, yanking her suddenly free. Gilly looked up into Solomon's face, gratitude filling her. He wrapped his arms around her, then set off down the tunnel, his eyes locked on hers. "I guess there are worse ways to die," she thought. Staring into his face, she leaned in, pressing her lips against his. "Dying in Solomon's arms is the best end I could hope for." She closed her eyes, her lungs having reached their limit, and slipped into unconsciousness. Chapter 24. Gilly gasped, sitting bolt upright. Her lungs ached, still burning from her near death within the mother's underwater lair. "I'm alive!" "About time," Solomon said with a faux grumble. "It's good to see you back in the land of the living." He shot her a grin, and it was the handsomest sight she'd ever seen. "Did someone miss me?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The dev chuckled. "I haven't had the time. We barely made it out of the tunnel you let us down, but we managed to make it to the surface, finding ourselves in a low cavern filled with flowing water. We allowed the currents to carry us onto the shores of an underground lake. I recognized the area and was able to lead us out." "And where are we now?" she asked, realizing they were no longer underground. Stars swirled over her head. The air had never tasted fresher.
Still outside Asdar, on the other side of the ridge. Your friend with the wings is busy casting her incantation.
He jerked a thumb over his shoulder where Phaedra was pouring the vial of white liquid into a shallow bowl she dug out of the dirt while Holly looked on.
We did it, Gilly comprehended while she watched the other Fae work. I'm going home. Her eyes flashed to Solomon, and she understood the momentous of the moment. This is goodbye. I don't know how to thank you, she started, taking his hand to pull herself to her feet. Gilly was bone-tired, her nerves fried, and the weight of her emotions were pressing down on her. I know that we may not have started this journey as friends, but I hope we're ending it that way. Solomon looked at her for a moment, and Gilly thought for a moment that he was going to say something meaningful, something she was longing to hear. Say you feel about me like I feel about you. Say you're coming with me. Instead, he gave her a tight nod.
For what it's worth, I'm sorry for the way I treated you when you arrived on this world.
And I'm sorry about the silver ring situation. She touched his shoulder. This is my final command. When I teleport away, you will remove the silver ring and toss it away for good. You'll be free of me, finally. His eyes were filled with feeling, but he said nothing. They stared at one another, tension saturating the space between them.
Gilly,
Holly called, motioning her over.
It's almost time.
She turned and moved closer to the Fae and her human companion. Solomon followed her, as if by habit, and they circled around the bowl in the dirt that was swirling with sparkling magic.
Get ready,
Phaedra said, reaching out to grab Holly's hand and indicating for Gilly to do the same. Entwining her hand with the human's, Gilly watched Solomon's face for any sign of regret. It appeared there, and she was taunted by the bittersweet emotion of the moment. Then a light flashed from the bowl surrounding them, and the world whooshed away from her, spinning her into a void. Goodbye, Solomon, she said in her mind, her heart aching in her chest at the knowledge that it was the last time she'd see the Dev in her life. Her feet hit the ground with a thump, and she barely managed to remain upright. The air felt suddenly different, cooler, moister, and filled with the smells of an ancient forest that reminded her so much of her home that she nearly wept. Instead of endless sands and dust, the world around her was verdant and sweet-smelling, tall trees surrounding them in a small forested grove. Although she rejoiced, her celebration was tinged with sadness. I already miss the Dev. I can't help it. A familiar roar filled her ears, and she started, turning in the direction of the noise to see Solomon. What is he doing here? She watched as the Dev ripped the silver ring from his finger and lobbed it deep into the forest. He flexed his muscles, and a moment later, his features contorted, his monstrous form taking over. Phaedra stood before him, her fingertips crackling with purple lightning. What are you doing? Gilly shouted, rushing toward the other Fae. You brought him here? With a flap of her wings, Phaedra lifted into the air, raising her hands at the Dev. Gilly took a flying leap, tackling the levitating Fae and tugging on her wings until she landed on solid ground. What have you done? A sudden commotion sounded in the brush around them, and a moment later winged Fae poured from the trees, most armed with bows or swords, all pointing at the bellowing Dev. Phaedra shoved against Gilly, managing to flip her over, then straddled her chest, her knees on Gilly's shoulders. Stop fighting this, she warned. Never one to give up a fight easily, Gilly bucked against her. She didn't want to resort to using her magic against an ally, but she was near mindless with anger and fear in equal measures. Get off me, or I'll blast you back into the Hell Realm. While she struggled to dislodge the Fae, Solomon launched into an attack, but he stopped mid-lunge, his features frozen, his body motionless. Gilly could see 3 winged Fae females standing nearby, hands linked, attention focused on the Dev. They're using magic to subdue him. She watched as chains made of silver were placed around his wrist. The 3 Fae released each other's hands, and Solomon tumbled forward, letting out a roar at the sight of the chains. Silence! The lead female of the 3 said, stepping forward, and his voice cut off mid-scream. She's controlling him through the silver, just like I did, Gilly realized, her temper bursting through her restraints. She closed her eyes and ran a current of energy through her skin, electrifying it momentarily. Phaedra let out a shriek like she was being scalded and rolled off Gilly,
giving her a chance to come to her feet. "Let him go!" she shouted, but the winged Fae ignored her. Giving another order, the Fae female marched Solomon out of the clearing and onto a path between the trees. Gilly rounded on Phaedra, who had climbed to her feet. She shoved the Fae, her anger overflowing. "What in the hell's is happening? Why did you bring him here?"
"Because a criminal like him doesn't get to escape punishment."
Phaedra dusted off her robes, her nose in the air. "You're out of your leafing mind," Gilly shouted. "We were leaving him behind. He helped us get the last ingredient, and we wouldn't have survived without his help against the mother."
"That doesn't justify what he did to us."
Phaedra rounded on her, her features sharp.
"Why are you protecting a slaver and a killer?"
"Because he isn't what you think he is." Gilly closed her eyes to try and get a handle on her emotions. "Just when I thought my troubles were at an end, I'm dragged right back into the mess that my life has become." She opened her eyes and fixed Phaedra with a stare. "What happens now? What are they going to do to him?"
"Imprison him,"
Phaedra responded, her tone matter-of-fact.
"He'll stand trial for his crimes, and if found guilty, they'll execute him."
Gilly covered her face with her hand, exhaustion filling every fiber of her being. "I can't let that happen."
"Cheer up,"
Phaedra said with a levity Gilly couldn't understand.
"Perhaps the council will grant him mercy."
She set off after the other Fae, motioning to the human to follow the same path. Letting out a heavy sigh, Gilly went after them. The forest gave way to a city of marble that was built into the landscape in a way that made it seem almost natural. Gilly couldn't help but wonder what it would have been like in her own Fae realm if her parents had built their cities in harmony with the wilds instead of clearing the forest to make way for their stone structures. Gilly found herself on a brick avenue that was littered with fallen leaves. She noticed other Fae around her, several of them stopping to look as the dev was led through the city. A few scurried out of the path of the prisoner and his captors. Their eyes filled with fear. Gilly tried to make a mental note of the path they traveled, but she was too distracted to make much headway, her mind filled with worry for Solomon. "Where are we going?" she asked after a while, catching up to Phaedra and Holly. The winged Fae pointed in the direction of a rounded building in the distance.
"The Citadel. It's where we keep those awaiting sentencing by the council."
Gilly grumbled under her breath, saying it sounded as if his guilt was a foregone conclusion. Phaedra just looked at her as if the answer was obvious. She could hear the creak of a large wooden door being opened up ahead as the winged Fae contingent dragged the silly dev inside. The doors were shutting behind them, and Gilly scurried forward, hoping to slip inside before it closed. When she reached the opening, she found herself confronted by two burly Fae, who crossed their spears to prevent her entry. "You may not pass," one of them told her in a bored tone. "I have to talk to your prisoner, the one who was just forced into this building against his will." She started forward again, but the crossed spears continued to block her path. The guard said nothing else, and after a moment she gave up, turning away in frustration. "This is all your fault," she told Phaedra. "You could have just left him behind. Tell these two that there's been a mistake. Solomon should be released."
"It's out of my hands now," Phaedra said with a shrug. "They take their orders from the council, not from me."
"So that's it. A sham trial and an execution. He deserves better."
"And he might get it. The council is known to be both wise and fair. You can plead your case before them this evening."
"I wouldn't have to plead anything if you just left Solomon on his own world like intended," Gilly scowled at her. "I hope this council is wiser and fairer than you've turned out to be."
"Can we stop arguing and find some place to get a drink of water and a change of clothes?"
Holly interrupted, looking as exhausted as Gilly felt. She turned to Phaedra, reminding her of an earlier promise.
"You said the first thing you'd show me when we arrived on your world was the baths. I feel as dirty as the time I played mud volleyball for charity."
Gilly had no idea what the human was talking about, but Phaedra seemed to have an idea. She nodded, taking a few steps away from the citadel and motioning for the others to follow.
"This way to the baths, ladies."
With a mournful glance back at the citadel, Gilly followed her companions, making a wordless vow to free Solomon at the first opportunity. Chapter 25. The early evening twilight painted the sky in oranges and purples, reminding Gilly of a healing bruise. She stared at the heavens as the stars began peeking through the swirls of color. Seated on a cold marble among Fae, with their wings politely tucked behind them,
Gilly wondered when Solomon's trial would begin. Holly sat beside her, her head leaning forward as sleep tried to claim her. She jerked awake, then started to nod off again. On Gilly's other side, Phaedra was talking softly to the Fae seated beside her, their conversation muted so that Gilly couldn't overhear their words. They were within an arena of sorts, a half-circle of built-in seats in rows stretching upwards, forming a half-circle. Spectators filled the rows, everyone turning out for what seemed destined to prove a spectacle that couldn't be missed. The other half of the circle was dominated by a dais upon which a long, tall table was sat. Far below the table, on the arena floor, was a square made of marble columns that were connected to a railing. Gilly imagined that this was the place where petitioners were positioned to plead their cases before the council. It was several long minutes before a horn sounded, and the Fae around her sat up, their attentions riveted on the dais. "So begins the session of the Fae Council of Valencia," a voice boomed through the arena, and Gilly's head craned around, attempting to ascertain where it was coming from. She failed, however, and returned her attention to the dais, where 3 figures in long, ornate white robes were taking their places at the tall table. "The council calls Phaedra the Relentless." Gilly glanced at Phaedra, whose eyes widened 1 second before she disappeared. She reappeared a moment later, standing in the petitioner's box. The Fae in the center seat at the table set his gaze upon her. He was older than the other 2, with flowing hair as white as his robes. "You are called to answer for your actions. Why did you abandon your post in the rough?" Phaedra blinked, clearly not expecting to be called to account.
"I did not abandon it willingly. I was ambushed, betrayed by an informant, and waylaid by a wily opponent who tricked me into being transported off-world. I landed in a hell realm and have been fighting my way back. I'm lucky to be standing before you today."
"Be that as it may, without you at your post, the rough has devolved into chaos. This is unacceptable."
Phaedra inclined her head.
"I will not rest until I have returned order to the rough, but I'm afraid that the vow I swore to mete out justice compelled me to return with a prisoner. He is one of the Dev, a wicked race bent on the destruction of all Fae."
A ripple went through the crowd, frantic whispers surrounding Gilly and making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on their own accord. Phaedra continued, her tone strident.
"This Dev deserves punishment on every one of that race due, but I will recount his crimes for the council so that you may consider them when you pass judgment on the prisoner."
The council and their audience listened with rapt attention as Phaedra recounted her tale of the slave auction and Solomon's raid, his enslavement of the Fae and her companions, and his attempts to sell them off to one of the princes of darkness.
"The Dev must be judged for his crimes,"
she finished, and Gilly winced when she heard the audience call out their support.
"Wait!"
she cried out, standing and waving her hand in the direction of the council. She launched herself down the steps and onto the floor, hurrying to where Phaedra stood.
"She's leaving out the good he did while we were trapped in his realm."
"Who speaks to the council without permission?"
the white-haired Fae called. He squinted his eyes, then sat back.
"A foreigner!"
Gilly nodded.
"I was with Phaedra at the slave auction, and much of what happened afterwards, and while the Dev did take us as possession at first, in the end he helped us gather what we needed to escape the Hell Realm and come here. If he hadn't fought on our side and protected me, I would not be here speaking to you today."
"And who exactly is speaking?"
the older man asked, leaning in to get a better look at her.
"What is your name, foreigner? And from whence do you originate?"
"I am Sagila of the Fae, member of the Winking Hand and commander of the Wildling forces," she announced, figuring her official title might go farther than a simple Gilly would in this setting.
Gasps went up all around her, and the council members sat up straighter, whispering to one another.
"A Fae, you say? How did you lose your wings?"
"I never had them," she explained. "I'm not from your realm, but from another. A realm ruled by the Fae Queen Elspeth and her consort King Lyre."
The gasps were even louder this time, and a roar went up from the crowd as hundreds of voices spoke at the same time. The white-haired man rocketed to his feet, raising his hands for silence. When the hubbub died down, he spoke, his voice echoing around the arena.
"The day of the prophecy is at hand,"
he intoned, his voice enhanced by magical means so that it carried beyond the arena to blanket the area. The prodigal daughter has returned. This session of the Fae Council is adjourned.
He clapped his hands above his head, the sound of thunder booming above him to accentuate his point.
What's going on here?
Gilly asked, leaning over towards Phaedra to make herself heard.
What prophecy is he talking about?
Phaedra was looking at her with wide eyes, her face pale. She shook her head, then turned to watch the white-haired council member coming toward them.
I think Sedaris is about to answer that question for you.
The older gentleman paused in front of Gilly, looking her up and down.
Sigila of the Fae, I am Sedaris, the voice of the people. We have long waited for your appearance, both with hope and apprehension. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. What is this prophecy you speak of? And does it have any bearing on this farce of a trial to punish the dead? Will Solomon be free?
Gilly knew it was a long shot, but she had to try.
The trial is not yet begun, he replied,
waving his hand to dismiss that question.
And the prophecy of which I speak is the most consequential one we possess.
He held out his hand in Gilly's direction.
If you will allow, I will show you what I mean.
Gilly glanced in the direction of Phaedra, who nodded, inclining her head in Sedaris' direction. Then she flapped her wings and easily cleared the railing in the petitioner's box, fluttering back in the direction of Holly, who was now sitting alone on the empty bench, the rest of the Fae having started to make their way out of the arena in orderly lines. Gilly let out a breath and put her hand in his. Let's go. The temple walls were thick with vines, little of the marble underneath showing through. Gilly followed Sedaris up the steps to the columned portico that ran around the building on all sides. Braziers burned at regular intervals, lighting their way through the darkening night.
This was the first temple our people built, long ago in the midst of times now lost. It has been a receptacle of Fae knowledge for eons, he explained. It is also the home of our most important prophecies, the words of our seers interpreted in pictures that can be easily interpreted.
He beckoned her through the archway that formed the entrance of the temple. Gilly walked through the arch to discover that the temple interior was a maze of walls, each one carved with intricate drawings, along with torches and braziers that lit up its corridors.
The one I have spoken of is this way, at the center of the temple.
She followed him past several carvings with figures and events of which she knew nothing at all. The old gentleman walked with brisk steps, making turn after turn until he stopped without warning, long after Gilly had lost all sense of direction.
We have arrived at the center.
He gestured to a narrow wall that climbed to the ceiling, its surface cluttered with carvings that were supposed to depict a prophecy that somehow concerned Gilly herself. What is all of this? She asked, approaching the wall and trying to make sense of the story illustrated there. Sedaris took his place at her side, pointing to the very top of the wall, where a female figure with delicate wings stood between two silhouettes, a male and a female, each wearing a shining crown.
Daughter of Fae royalty, he said by way of explanation, brought forward to answer for a crime against her people.
The next image just below it featured the same female figure. This time, her intricate golden wings were replaced by waves of red hair tumbling down her back. She slumped alone at the center of what resembled a spiderweb of shining gossamer strands, her posture the epitome of deep sadness.
Shunned by her people and exiled from the realm, sent to wander the web, only to return one day to reap the maelstrom.
Gilly's eyes jumped to the next panel, then she let out a gasp. The woman depicted there held two babes in her arms, a look of determination in her gleaming eyes. That looks just like Elsbeth, which means I'm one of those babes. She whirled on Sedaris.
The Great Annihilation! What is that?
She fought the urge to grab the man by his robes and shake him until the answers she needed tumbled out of him like leaves off a tree in a windstorm.
One day the Fae Queen Elsbeth, as you call her, will return to Valentia, the realm of her birth, and start in motion an apocalypse that could destroy both realms.
Realm of her birth? Are you saying that my mother hails from this realm? She shook her head, unbelieving. Elsbeth had created her realm and filled it with life and light. Gilly had never thought of her as coming from somewhere else. She was intrinsic to the Fae Wilds, but she must have come from somewhere else, she realized.
The council member gave her a moment to absorb what had been revealed.
Valencia has been the home of the Fae since existence began. Any other realms our race inhabits are not their original home. Our realm predates yours, and your mother would not have had the power to create your realm if she had not been a Fae royal of considerable strength and determination.
Gilly frowned. You said she was shunned and banished. What did she do? Sedadris held his tongue, which only made Gilly's need to know greater. What could have been terrible enough for her parents to exile her from the only realm she'd ever known? The white-haired man fixed his gaze on hers.
It wasn't what she did, but what she was going to do. The Great Annihilation won't only destroy Valencia, but it will sweep through the web, burning out every realm and bringing about the end of existence as we know it.
Gilly struggled to breathe, the weight of the older man's words weighing her down. My mother is going to bring about the apocalypse? How could that be possible?
Not your mother alone, he said,
gesturing toward another panel, where 2 Fae females with identical features stood beside the red-headed Elspeth at the center of a swirling mass of chaos. No, she said in a hoarse whisper. Gilly shook her head and slowly backed away from the panel, not wanting to accept what her eyes were showing her. I fought my way here through the greatest perils of my lifetime, seeking only safety. Now I find out that my family are the harbingers of the end of the web and all life as we know it. Gilly didn't want to accept it, didn't want to believe that she had a role to play in the annihilation of the multiverse. But the proof was there in blazing color, right in front of her. She turned away, tears filling her eyes. This can't be true, can it? Will we really be at the heart of the apocalypse, as the prophecy states? Despite her disbelief, she could see only sincerity in Sedaris' features. He believes it, as did those gathered at the arena today. An entire race of Fae, one that predates my own, can't be wrong, can they? Dashing the tears from her eyes, Gilly succumbed to the grief that had haunted her since she had been kidnapped from her own realm and dragged into a minefield with enemies on all sides. Perhaps the biggest enemy all along was myself, she mused, feeling sick to her stomach. She exited the temple and stared off into the night, trying to come to grips with what she'd just learned. Staring up into the starry night, Gilly prayed for redemption, not just for herself, but for all those who would burn in the great annihilation that would be set in motion by her mother's own hand. There is no escaping destiny. Gilly remembered the vampire's words, her shoulders slumping over the weight of the temple's revelation. Let's pray that the leech was wrong, under the strange stars in a foreign realm. Sagila of the Fae called out to whatever forces of good still existed in the universe. Please let him be wrong. Epilogue. The witch's chanting reminded her of the droning of bees in their hive. The empress of spiders blinked through the thick smoking, feeling drowsy. She'd come to the witch's coven out of desperation, her efforts to locate Gilly on her own having led to nothing but dead ends. Hurry up, she thought, impatience building. For ages she'd been bent on robbing the Fae Queen of her immense powers, but after the rout of her former partner and powerful sorceress, Rashawn, also known as the Eater of Worlds, before his defeat at Elspeth's hands, she was forced to adjust her plans.
Her daughter may not be as formidable as her mother, but her powers are nothing to sneeze at, and once I have her abilities, I can use them to close in on my real target.
Willa sighed in satisfaction at the thought of controlling the Fae Queen's magic.
I could create a realm of my own, one where my pets are free to roam, to hunt, to eat.
Her attention was called back to the scene in front of her when a scream rent the night. They were gathered in a loose ring, bordered by bonfires on top of a grassy hill. The smoke traced ladders to the night sky above, a cold sky that ignored the goings-on of the women gathered on the hill. One of the witches fell, her naked body collapsing in a heap.
I've been struck blind, she screeched,
reaching out with unseeing eyes for her companions.
What have you seen?
Asked an older woman with stringy gray hair hanging lank down her back.
What is it that has blinded you?
Willa leaned in with interest at the witch's response.
A beautiful and terrible woman with magic, the likes of which I've never known,
the blind one intoned, pulling herself to her feet and raising her hands to the heavens.
It is she who will bring about the great annihilation, when darkness will spread across the land, and the forces of evil will claim their rule.
Her voice took on a hushed tone.
The children of her creation will serve as her heralds, one of the end and one of the beginning. Their twin faces will be the last thing the universe sees before collapsing into the dark.
The Fae Queen, Elspeth, and her offspring, Willa filled in, her words eager. She rubbed her hands together, pleased that her attempt had borne fruit.
These witches don't come cheap,
She repressed a giggle.
although it's not like I'm going to let them keep their payment. Where can I find her children? She has been struck blind,
The witch with stringy hair gasped.
It is too dangerous to delve deeper. Nonsense,
Willa said, her smile warm but her tone colder than a frigid winter's eve.
Scry again and tell me where they are. Now!
When the lead witch hesitated, Willa let her mask slip, revealing the creature that had dwelt beneath. The witch cowered, holding up her hands in surrender.
We will scry as you command.
The chanting rose again, circling with the smoke until it built to a crescendo. There were several screams this time as witches began to drop, one after another, writhing in the grass and contorting their bodies in agony at the sights that were unfurling inside their minds. The lead witch trembled but managed to keep her feet. The chanting stopped suddenly, and the witch raised her hands to the heavens, her naked flesh drooping and sagging.
Seek the children on separate worlds, she intoned. One is at her mother's bosom, the other in her mother's birthplace.
Her mother's bosom, Willis said, tapping her chin.
That must mean Elspeth's realm. But what about the other realm, Elspeth's birthplace? Where can I find it?
We have spoken, the witch said, wiping sweat from her brow, then reaching down to help one of her coven to a standing position. Around the hilltop, witches were recovering from their meditations, muscles trembling as they regained their feet.
We have scried as you asked. If you are not pleased with the results, we cannot help you. Typical witchery. Always up for a little bait and switch, aren't you?
Witches were known for their extortion, doling out hints about the results of their scrying to squeeze the coin purses of those who'd hired them.
Except I'm the one who does the squeezing, she thought, with an evil smile.
Willa inhaled, drawing on her powers, smiling, as she always did, as she felt the magic fill her.
But I think I can convince you to be a little more helpful.
Closing her eyes, she summoned her 8-legged companions. It was her most treasured ability, one that another might find useless, but one from which Willa derived great joy. They were her most trusted confidants, her comfort in dark times. They were all the friends she would ever want or need. The Empress of Spiders felt her creatures take form around her, and opening her eyes, she fixed the witches with a bright smile.
Can you hear them? She asked in a conversational tone. They're headed this way.
The witches looked from one to another. Then the lead witch froze, her eyes wide as saucers. Willa knew she could hear them, could hear their legs as they climbed the grassy hillsides, zeroing in on their quarry.
Elspeth's birthplace,
Willa said again.
Where is it? Valentia,
the woman replied, her voice trembling.
Seek the second twin on Valentia, the realm of the winged Fae. There, Willa said with a little clap. That wasn't so hard, was it?
The lead witch shook her head, scraggly hair flying.
We have done what you asked. Please, now call off your pets. But they've actually already arrived, Willa said with regret. I can't send them away again without letting them play a little first.
Willa settled in on a flat rock just outside the circle of fires. She crossed her legs, fixing her gaze on the witches, who were scrambling to conceive of a strategy to avoid their fates.
You can't escape your destiny, she thought absently,
then turned her thoughts to her plan.
Valentia, one more round to go until I claim what I am due.
She'd spent the last several days consolidating her powers.
In fact, I've practically gorged myself on magic users.
Willa had sucked up dry any of her kind she'd come across, adding their powers to her own, until she was almost as powerful as she'd been before Rashawn had betrayed her.
But when I find the Fae and drain her, I'll be more powerful than ever before.
Excitement bubbled away inside her. There were many abilities that Willa craved to steal, especially the rare talent Gilly had for shapeshifting.
That glamour is worth all the trouble I've gone through alone. I can become anyone or anything I fancy. I can even become Gilly herself.
Willa gave a giggle at the thought of disguising herself as the wildling Fae herself.
For all the things she insulted me, all the times she judged me as coming up short. With her powers and her shape, I'll make the Fae Realm tremble.
And once she had one twin's power, it would be a cinch to trick the other twin into her clutches. She knew of Lena's respect for her more marital sister. If Gilly called, her sister Lena would come running.
Running right into my web.
With both twins' abilities coursing through her, Willa knew she'd be able to take on her original target.
Elspeth's powers, just like her children, will become mine to play with.
She couldn't hold back a cackle of delight at the prospect. The witches might have warned her about the looming apocalypse, but Willa wasn't worried about annihilation.
If anyone is bound to dismantle the web, it will be me and my pets,
she thought with a rush of vanity. The first scream brought her attention back to the scene before her. Her darlings were just now cresting the hill and rushing toward the prey she'd assembled for them. 8-legged pets of all sizes, from coins up to wild dogs, rushed forward, intent on feeding off the witches, who were clumped together in the center of the hill, fighting for their lives. Willa watched it all with a wide grin, joy at the notion that all of her scheming was finally coming to fruition. The witches attempted to shield themselves, a glowing dome springing to life around them, protecting them from her pets. With a laugh, Willa cleared away their dome with a wave of her hand.
Witches might be useful for their ability to see across vast distances, to peer into the future and the past, but their magic is no match for mine, not when it comes to what I do best.
Chaos ensued as the dome fell, witches running this way and that, trying to escape the death that was bearing down on them with 8 legs. A chorus of screams erupted as the spiders began to take down their prey. Fangs sunk deep into unprotected skin, and Willa knew that her pets would drink their fill that night. She stood dusting her dress and setting off down the hillside to where she'd left the portal open for her to return to the pocket dimension she'd created for herself. She began whistling a jaunty tune as she walked, happier than she'd been in ages. Like a woman on the verge of getting everything she wished for, Willa sashayed into the night, ready to wreak havoc on this world and all the others she intended to rule. The end.